There are moments in human history when the quiet conviction of one mind changes the course of a nation. Freedom, after all, is not born from noise, but from the stillness of a conscience refusing to yield. It begins in the silence of thought, in a single life, determined to stand upright against the weight of conformity. Good evening, wherever you may be, perhaps by the window as night gathers, or walking beneath soft streetlights, the world slowing around you. You are part of a vast circle of memory, a living archive of the past listening again to its heartbeat. Tell us in the comments where and when history finds you tonight. And if this shared remembrance stirs you, subscribe to help keep these voices alive. Now let us begin. The story of John Adams does not start in marble halls or among the mighty of Europe, but on a cold New England morning in the small village of Braintree, Massachusetts. The year was 1735. The fields were heavy with frost, and the wind carried the scent of salt from the nearby bay. In a modest farmhouse stood a boy who would one day argue the meaning of liberty before the world had even agreed what liberty was. His father, Deacon John Adams, was a farmer and a shoemaker, a man of scripture and soil. His mother, Susanna Boylston, carried the sharp wit and pride of an old New England lineage. From them, the boy inherited both the sternness of faith and the quickness of mind that would define him. In Braintree, life was plain, austere, and bound to the seasons. Yet the boy, restless and serious, looked beyond the furrows his father plowed. The Puritan ethic ran deep: humility, discipline, duty to God. But young John's eyes were drawn to questions that had no place in the family prayers. What was virtue? What made authority just? Why did some command and others obey? Such thoughts seemed impractical in a village of farmers, yet they stirred in him like seeds waiting for spring. The rhythm of his childhood was marked by the tolling of church bells and the creak of oxen pulling through stony soil. He often walked alone along the narrow paths that wound through the orchards, his mind alive with arguments and daydreams. Some said he was too serious for a child. Others thought him proud. In truth, he was both. A boy aware of something vast within himself, but unsure of its purpose. Later in life, he would confess that even as a youth, he felt haunted by the desire to distinguish himself, to prove worthy of existence in a moral universe. His father hoped he might become a minister, as so many promising sons of Massachusetts had done. The pulpit was the highest calling, and the Adams family prized piety as much as learning. But John hesitated. The sermons of the time, heavy with damnation and duty, seemed to him more fearful than divine. He longed not to preach obedience, but to understand the structure of truth itself. When he finally entered Harvard College at the age of 16, it was not with the heart of a zealot, but of a skeptic disguised in Puritan clothing. The world of Braintree, though small, was part of a vast colonial web stretching across the Atlantic. British ships came and went through Boston Harbor, carrying not just goods, but ideas. Pamphlets from London, stories of the Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Newton, Montesquieu, all drifted ashore like contraband of the mind. Adams read them hungrily, his curiosity deepening with every page. Yet he never lost his New England caution. Liberty, he believed, was not license. Freedom required order. Even as a youth, his thoughts wrestled with this tension that would define his life: how to balance the chaos of human will with the discipline of law. Neighbors recalled his intensity, how he could debate for hours about the moral worth of ambition. He once wrote that vanity was an endless hunger, yet he recognized it in himself. That honesty, that almost painful self-awareness, made him at once admirable and difficult. In his private diary, he confessed to fears of failure, of mediocrity. "I am but an ordinary man," he wrote, "but ordinary men may do extraordinary things if they remain true." At school, he studied Latin, logic and the moral philosophy that shaped colonial thought. Yet it was not the theology that held him, but the precision of reasoning, the beauty of argument, the clarity of words that could bind or liberate nations. He began to see law as a living scripture of society, written not by divine command but by the consent of free minds. In later years, he would recall how even in his youth he admired the law's balance, its insistence that right and wrong be weighed, not assumed. The fields of Braintree became, in memory, a metaphor for his own inner landscape, stubborn, rocky, and yet fertile. He would write that virtue must be cultivated like a New England crop, through labor, restraint, and the refusal to surrender to ease. Perhaps it was that discipline that made him both revered and resented in public life. He expected of men the same exacting honesty he demanded of himself, and few could bear it. In the evenings, when work was done and candles burned low, he would sit by the small window of the farmhouse, watching the sky turn over the dark hills. Beyond those hills lay Boston, and beyond Boston, a world he had only read about. But he felt it calling. The stars, he later wrote, seemed the lights of reason scattered by God across the abyss. To follow them would mean leaving behind the quiet piety of his fathers. Yet something in him knew that salvation would not be found in submission, but in struggle. He once described his youth as a time of timid aspirations. It is a phrase that reveals much, the awareness of greatness paired with the fear of its cost. That tension would haunt him all his life. He would never be at ease with fame, nor at peace without it. The Puritan child and the revolutionary philosopher would forever contend within him. In later years, those who met him as a statesman would see only the stern exterior, the lawyer's precision, the president's temper. Few could imagine the boy who once walked through apple blossoms, reciting Cicero under his breath, dreaming not of power, but of purpose. And yet it was in that boy that the foundation of the Republic's conscience was laid, not in Washington's grandeur, nor Jefferson's eloquence, but in the restless, stubborn heart of a farmer's son from Braintree. The wind outside his childhood home would whisper through the fields each autumn, carrying with it the scent of harvest and decay, a reminder that even in abundance there is impermanence. Perhaps he sensed, even then, that his life, too, would be a harvest, both celebrated and misunderstood. And as the boy looked up at the night sky, seeing not constellations but questions, the future stirred unseen around him. A nation not yet born, a destiny not yet spoken, a voice learning to test its strength against eternity. The faint scent of parchment and ink lingered in the dim corridors of Harvard College, where the old beams creaked above students' whispered debates and the candles guttered in the draft from open windows. It was here, amid the heavy silence of books and ambition, that John Adams began to shed the skin of his provincial youth and assume the restless mind of a thinker. The boy who once stared at the fields of Braintree now found himself surrounded by the new language of reason, of experiment, of enlightenment. Yet even as he inhaled the radical air of philosophy, he remained bound by the Puritan sense of self-examination that would forever make him both scholar and confessor. Harvard in the 1750s was still a place where religion held authority, but the old order was beginning to tremble. The world beyond New England spoke of natural rights, of laws not decreed by kings, but discovered by reason. Locke, Newton, and Montesquieu began to whisper from the pages of borrowed books, their words as dangerous as they were divine. Adams read them with both reverence and unease, as if he sensed that the truths they contained could liberate the mind but also unsettle the soul. He would later write that to think freely was both a blessing and a torment, for once the chains of certainty are broken, the spirit is forever wandering. He studied Latin, moral philosophy, and the discipline of logic with an almost devotional rigor, Every word he copied into his notebooks was an attempt to find order in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Yet, beneath his diligence lay a tremor of rebellion. He admired the symmetry of law more than the mystery of grace, and he began to suspect that reason, not revelation, was the truer measure of virtue. Still, he did not discard faith. He merely tried to refine it. His letters from this period reveal a young man both proud and doubtful, a mind already wrestling with the tension between humility and greatness. He wrote of ambition as though it were a disease. "I am full of vanity," he confessed, yet he could not stop feeding it. Perhaps he understood even then that the thirst for recognition is inseparable from the drive to serve. In the quiet of his dormitory, he often sat by the flickering light of a tallow candle, its smoke curling toward the cracked ceiling, while outside, the snow fell soundlessly upon Cambridge. He would read until his eyes ached, the words of Cicero, Bacon, and Milton filling him with a strange companionship. Their voices, echoing across centuries, convinced him that the life of the mind could be a form of immortality. Yet Adams was not content with mere contemplation. He wanted his thoughts to matter, to shape the laws that governed men. He was not born to be a philosopher alone. He was born to be a participant in the grand experiment of civilization itself. Still, he feared the arrogance of intellect without conscience. He warned himself in his diary against the poison of pride, reminding his future self that knowledge without virtue is the ruin of nations. Outside the college gates, the colony of Massachusetts pulsed with contradictions. The British Empire stood firm in its authority, yet beneath that facade, murmurs of discontent were growing. Adams absorbed this atmosphere of subtle rebellion like a student of human nature. He saw how men bowed to power even as they despised it. He wondered if courage was rarer than intelligence, if the moral strength to resist injustice required more than education, perhaps a certain stubbornness of the soul. He began to see that reason must sometimes arm itself against comfort, that truth demanded confrontation. In this conviction lay the seed of the revolutionary he would become. His professors noted his intensity, his unwillingness to flatter, his sharpness in debate that sometimes bordered on defiance. Fellow students found him earnest, occasionally overbearing, yet irresistibly compelling when he spoke of duty and the destiny of mankind. He could turn even a classroom discussion into a moral trial, dissecting not only the argument, but the motives behind it. That habit of interrogation, of himself, of others, of the world, never left him. It became his signature virtue and his lifelong burden. When graduation approached, Adams faced the expectation of entering the ministry. His father, proud and frugal, had sacrificed much to send him to Harvard, believing the pulpit to be the highest calling. But John hesitated at the threshold. The idea of preaching faith that he himself questioned felt dishonest. "I have not the gifts of a divine," he admitted to himself. Instead, his attention turned toward the law, a profession that demanded intellect, precision, and a moral code grounded not in mystery, but in reason. The law, he thought, might reconcile his need for justice with his reverence for order. It offered a way to serve both God and humanity without surrendering the independence of his mind. His decision to study law was not made lightly. In that choice, he broke from tradition, from his father's hopes, from the path of ease. He would later reflect that every great decision in his life was accompanied by solitude. There was no chorus of approval, only the quiet certainty that he must follow conscience, however uncertain the outcome. It was this same inner compass that would later guide him through revolution and presidency alike, the conviction that truth, though often lonely, is its own reward. In the summer after his graduation, Adams returned to Braintree. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the hum of crickets. The village seemed unchanged, yet he no longer fit within its narrow rhythms. His education had given him new eyes. He walked the same paths, but the fields now appeared like a metaphor for the human condition, full of toil, promise, and impermanence. His father asked him to help with the harvest, and he did so willingly, yet his thoughts were elsewhere, already envisioning the life that awaited him beyond the horizon. He knew that the law would not make him rich, but it would give him purpose. That autumn, he began his apprenticeship with the lawyer James Putnam in Worcester, a small town where he would learn the art of rhetoric and the patience of study. It was there, in a modest chamber lined with dusty volumes, that Adams first tasted the gravity of justice, the delicate balance between authority and fairness. He copied legal arguments by hand, memorized precedents, and listened to cases that revealed the passions and frailties of ordinary men. The work was tedious, the pay meager, yet he found satisfaction in its rigor. The law, unlike theology, did not demand belief. It demanded clarity. At night, after long hours of reading, he would step outside and gaze at the stars. He wrote in his diary that they seemed to him the eyes of heaven, watching silently as men debated truth and error. In those moments, he felt both insignificant and infinite, a paradox that would define his philosophy forever. For Adams, the human mind was a small but divine instrument, capable of perceiving moral law even amid the chaos of politics. He resolved to keep that law within himself, to let reason be his faith. Years later, when his world expanded to include revolutions, kings, and constitutions, he would still recall the quiet nights of his youth, the solitude of Harvard's candlelight, the smell of old paper, the sound of his pen scratching across the page. It was there that the architecture of his conscience was built, stone by stone, line by line. The young scholar who once doubted his place among the faithful had unknowingly prepared himself for a greater ministry, not of the church, but of a nation still waiting to be born. And so, as the young man packed his few belongings to leave Harvard behind, the sound of distant bells echoed over the Charles River. They marked not only the passing of time, but the awakening of a purpose. He walked into the fading light of afternoon, his mind alive with ideas, his heart divided between fear and faith in his own destiny. The evening air carried the faint scent of smoke and pine, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked against the coming night. It was a small, unremarkable moment in the life of a student, yet from that moment the path of a future president began to unfold, silent and certain as the turning of the stars. Boston in the 1760s was a city alive with noise and contradiction, a harbor town whose cobbled streets echoed with the clang of hammers, the shouts of sailors, and the occasional sharp crack of muskets from the garrison on King Street. It was here, amid the tension of empire and resistance, that John Adams came of age as a lawyer and a man of conscience. His chambers were small, his books few, yet he treated each case as a test, not merely of law, but of principle. He believed that justice was not a luxury of peace, but the foundation of freedom, and that even in the chaos of politics, reason must prevail over passion. In those early years, he walked daily from Braintree to Boston on foot, the dust clinging to his shoes, his mind filled with arguments and observations. He studied human behavior in the taverns, in the marketplace, and in the courtrooms where the fates of men were decided by words. He began to see that truth was never pure, that justice required the courage to navigate ambiguity without losing sight of integrity. He was not yet famous, nor even particularly prosperous. He lived modestly, ate little, and spent his evenings reading under candlelight, while the city around him drank and debated. Yet within him grew the steady conviction that law, when guided by morality, could be the instrument of civilization. "Every man," he once wrote, "has a right to be heard and to be defended." That belief, simple yet absolute, would soon place him at the center of one of the most dangerous trials in American history. For in 1770, the tension between British authority and colonial resentment erupted violently in the snow-covered streets of Boston. 5 men lay dead, shot by British soldiers during what would come to be known as the Boston Massacre. The town demanded vengeance. Crowds gathered, pamphlets circulated, and anger flared like a fever. To stand with the soldiers was to stand against the people. Yet John Adams, after careful thought and sleepless nights, agreed to defend them. It was not sympathy for Britain that moved him, but fidelity to principle. He believed that even an enemy was entitled to justice, and that truth must not bend to fury. "Facts are stubborn things," he declared to the jury, "and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." His words carried through the courtroom like a steady bell, unshaken by the murmur of the crowd. He argued not for their innocence, but for fairness. That guilt must be proven, not presumed. When the verdict came, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted, and the remaining 2 were found guilty only of manslaughter, their punishment, light. To many, Adams became a traitor. His reputation suffered. Yet in the quiet of his diary, he felt no regret. He wrote that his actions had cost him a wave of unpopularity, but added, "It was one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country." For he understood that a nation's liberty depends not on vengeance, but on law. The trial left him weary, but resolute. He had glimpsed the thin line between mob justice and lawful order, between rebellion and anarchy. He knew that if America was ever to claim independence, it must learn to temper passion with principle. In that winter of turmoil, the seeds of his political philosophy were sown, that freedom without restraint leads to ruin, and that virtue, not power, must be the guardian of a republic. Yet he also saw, perhaps for the first time, the loneliness of such convictions. The people he sought to serve did not always understand the discipline he demanded. They wanted heroes of fire and fury, not men who argued for the sober dignity of reason. His personal life during these years offered him refuge and strength. In 1764, he married Abigail Smith, the daughter of a minister from Weymouth, a woman whose intellect and spirit matched his own. Their union was one of mutual respect, sustained by letters that remain among the most tender and articulate exchanges in American history. Abigail understood the demands of conscience and the cost of principle. When public opinion turned against him after the trial, she reminded him that the path of duty is the way to glory, and her faith in his moral compass steadied him. Together, they built a home in Braintree that became both sanctuary and study, a place where ideals were debated as naturally as the weather. But the peace of domestic life could not last long. The world beyond Massachusetts was beginning to fracture. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the growing unrest in Boston, all these events pressed upon Adams with the inevitability of history. He saw that the colonies were no longer merely subjects of an empire. They were participants in an awakening of political consciousness. Yet he also feared the excesses of rebellion. In his essays and letters, he warned that liberty unrestrained could dissolve into chaos. "The passions of men," he wrote, "will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. To defend freedom was not to indulge anger, but to discipline it." That belief would set him apart from many of his contemporaries, even as it made him indispensable to the birth of the nation. The city grew more volatile each year. Riots, protests, and boycotts became the daily language of defiance. British troops patrolled the streets, their red coats a constant reminder of authority. Adams, now recognized as one of Boston's most eloquent thinkers, began to write political essays under pseudonyms, calling for the recognition of natural rights and the limits of tyranny. His tone was measured but firm, his arguments steeped in the moral logic of the Enlightenment. He did not yet call for revolution, but he prepared the ground for it by shaping the vocabulary of resistance. He understood that before men could fight for freedom, they must first learn to think freely. At times, he felt the weight of contradiction pressing upon him, the Puritans' loyalty to order against the philosopher's call for liberty, the lawyer's respect for precedent against the patriot's urge to break it. In those moments, he turned inward, writing in his journal of doubt and duty, of the difficulty of remaining virtuous in a corrupt world. His words reveal not a zealot, but a thinker in conflict, one who knew that ideals are pure only until tested by circumstance. And yet he persisted. For Adams, morality was not a luxury of peace, but the compass by which men must navigate storm. As winter deepened, the harbor froze, and the city's fires burned low. Adams often walked alone through the narrow streets, his cloak drawn tight, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He would pause before the courthouse, remembering the trial that had nearly ruined him, and feel again the quiet pride of having stood where few dared. In that cold silence, he might have wondered whether history would remember him kindly, or whether his insistence on principle would forever make him the lonely conscience of his age. The wind off the harbor cut through his thoughts like a question that would never leave him. Could a nation built on reason survive the passions of men? The answer lay still in the future, as uncertain as the sea beyond the frozen docks. Yet even now, in this young lawyer's struggle between duty and desire, between approval and truth, the outline of a new kind of patriot was emerging, one who believed that courage was not found in shouting loudest, but in standing firm when silence would be easier. And as the lamps dimmed in the windows of Boston, the faint echo of that belief lingered in the air, a prelude to the coming storm that would soon sweep the colonies into revolution. The wind that swept through Boston in the spring of 1774 carried more than the scent of salt and smoke. It carried rumor, anger, and the uneasy breath of change. Ships stood idle in the harbor, their masts swaying like weary sentinels. As word spread that Parliament had closed the port in punishment for the tea that now lay buried beneath the water. Trade halted, hunger grew, and the city's pulse quickened into defiance. In taverns and church halls, men whispered of rights, of tyranny, of a distant king who knew nothing of their lives. Among them, John Adams listened, not as an agitator, but as a witness to history in motion. His legal mind grasped the enormity of what was coming. His conscience wrestled with it. He had defended law against mob violence, yet now the law itself seemed to have become the instrument of oppression. He wrote in his diary that an empire could not rule by fear and expect obedience to endure. Liberty, he reflected, must rest on the consent of the governed, or it is but a phantom. Still, he hesitated. The idea of rebellion frightened him as much as it inspired him, for he knew that passion could ignite chaos, and chaos could devour principle. In the quiet of his home in Braintree, Abigail watched him struggle with the weight of his thoughts. Their letters from this period reveal the intimacy of shared doubt. She urged him to act, to lend his voice to the cause that was shaping the destiny of their children. "You cannot be idle when the world is in motion," she wrote, her words both plea and prophecy. Adams knew she was right. He was no longer merely a lawyer. He was a citizen of an awakening nation, and conscience demanded engagement. When Massachusetts chose its delegates for the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he was among them. He accepted not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of duty. "The die is cast," he wrote to Abigail. "The Rubicon is passed." The journey south in late summer was long and uncertain. The roads were rough, the taverns crude, and at every stop he heard a different version of the same story: grievance, loyalty, hope, fear. The colonies were like siblings bound by circumstance, yet divided by temperament. Adams observed it all with the dispassionate eye of a philosopher and the anxious heart of a patriot. When he arrived in Philadelphia, he found a city humming with nervous purpose. Delegates from 12 colonies gathered under one roof, each carrying the burden of his province's expectations. The air inside Carpenter's Hall was thick with debate, the smell of sweat and parchment mingling beneath the flickering lamps. Here, at last, the voices of America began to test their strength. Adams did not charm easily, nor was he charmed. His manner was blunt, his speech direct, his temper easily kindled. He lacked the graceful diplomacy of men like John Dickinson or the easy eloquence of Jefferson, but he possessed something rarer, an unyielding integrity that gave his words weight even when they caused discomfort. He spoke often and with conviction, insisting that liberty was not a privilege granted by empire but a birthright grounded in natural law. To some he seemed reckless, to others prophetic. In the evenings he would return to his lodgings, exhausted, his mind still ablaze with argument. He missed the quiet of Braintree, the sound of his children's laughter drifting from the fields, but he knew that the work before him demanded sacrifice. Abigail's letters reached him with the regularity of grace, filled with domestic detail and philosophical reflection. She reminded him that revolutions were not only fought by men in chambers, but by women who kept the world from collapsing at home. As the Congress debated petitions, boycotts, and declarations, Adams watched the delicate dance of politics unfold. There were those who sought reconciliation with Britain, fearing the ruin of independence, and others who whispered of war as if it were salvation. Adams, ever the realist, knew that compromise was a fading illusion. "The breach," he wrote, "is made and cannot be healed." Yet he did not crave war, he dreaded it. He imagined the blood that would soak the soil of New England, the chaos that might follow, the test of character that would reveal whether the colonies were truly prepared to govern themselves. In his letters, he confessed that courage was often indistinguishable from despair. When he returned to Massachusetts after the first Congress, he found his homeland already transformed. The militia drilled in open fields, British troops occupied Boston, and the countryside buzzed with anticipation. The old world was dissolving before his eyes. He rode through the familiar lanes of Braintree and saw men he had known since childhood, now speaking of liberty as if it were a new religion. The spirit of rebellion had spread beyond politics. It had entered the hearts of farmers and blacksmiths, ministers and apprentices. He could not stop it, nor did he wish to. "A spark," he wrote, "has been struck that cannot be extinguished." The following year, when gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord, Adams was again in Philadelphia. The reports reached him like distant thunder. He rose before dawn and walked alone through the misty streets, his thoughts a storm of grief and resolve. The die he had spoken of was no longer a metaphor, it was a reality written in blood. The colonies were at war. That same day he wrote to Abigail, his words both steady and trembling. "The day is past, the sword is drawn and the scabbard thrown away." From that moment his life was no longer his own. Duty became his companion, principle his burden. He labored tirelessly in Congress, shaping committees, drafting resolutions, persuading the hesitant that independence was not madness but necessity. He worked for months with a kind of ascetic fervor, living on plain meals and restless nights. His letters home grew shorter, his tone more solemn. The weight of the future pressed upon him, yet he clung to the belief that order could be forged from upheaval if men remained true to reason. Through it all, he carried within him the same conflict that had defined his youth, the struggle between conviction and doubt, between the need to act and the fear of consequence. He was not a man of easy faith. He demanded evidence even from destiny. Yet as he stood in the chamber of the Continental Congress, surrounded by the murmurs of history in the making, he began to understand that some truths must be seized before they can be proven. He closed his eyes and saw again the fields of Braintree, the sky vast and indifferent above him, and he knew that the same quiet force that had once guided his boyhood thoughts now guided a people toward their uncertain freedom. The night before the vote for independence, Adams walked the streets of Philadelphia in silence. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of summer rain drifting through the alleys. From open windows came the faint sound of hymns, the murmurs of men praying for courage. He paused beneath the bell tower and listened to the wind against the wood, its rhythm like a heartbeat. He thought of his children, of Abigail, of the fragile dream that bound 13 colonies together in defiance of the greatest empire on earth. "May posterity never forget," he whispered to himself, "that we did all we could." Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, unaware that by morning his words would help set the world aflame. The morning light in Philadelphia was thick with humidity and tension, a pale haze that seemed to muffle sound and hold breath. Inside the brick walls of Independence Hall, the air carried the smell of sweat, ink, and candle wax, the scent of history before it knows itself. Men gathered in clusters, some whispering, others pacing, their eyes betraying sleepless nights and the weight of consequence. John Adams stood among them, his hands clasped behind his back, his coat neatly buttoned despite the heat. He had argued for this moment for months, had spoken until his voice broke and his patience thinned, pressing his fellow delegates to see what he believed was already written in the nature of things, that a people cannot be governed by a power that denies their consent. Yet now, with the decision at hand, he felt neither triumph nor ease. He felt only gravity. To sever from Britain was not merely to defy a king, it was to wager civilization on conscience. He had clashed fiercely with John Dickinson, the eloquent advocate of reconciliation, and had grown impatient with those who hesitated, fearing chaos more than tyranny. "Objects of the most stupendous magnitude," he told them, "are now before us. We are in the very midst of a revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations." His words struck like sparks on dry tinder. Even those who doubted him could not ignore the conviction that burned behind them. Yet conviction alone was not enough. He knew how easily passion could consume reason. In letters to Abigail, he confessed his fears, that independence, once achieved, might dissolve into faction, corruption, and pride. "Democracy," he warned, "never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." He did not seek revolution for glory, but for necessity, a bitter medicine for a diseased empire. The vote, when it came, was not accompanied by cheers or celebration. It was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken prayers. One by one, the colonies declared their assent. Adams, seated beside men whose names would soon become immortal, felt the moment pass through him like a chill. He did not look around for approval. Instead, he looked inward, and in that silence, he thought of Abigail. He knew she would understand the solemn beauty of this act, the mingling of hope and dread that accompanies every birth of freedom. Later that day, he wrote to her, calling it the most important epoch in the history of America, yet predicting that, "You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states." Thomas Jefferson's pen would give the Declaration its language, but Adams had given it its heartbeat. He had been the instrument of persuasion, the architect of resolve. Without his persistence, the idea might have remained talk and hesitation. Yet he did not envy Jefferson the authorship. In later years, when glory had ripened into myth, Adams would recall those days with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "You have written it well," he once told Jefferson, "but I labored for it." His words were not bitter, only precise. For Adams, fame was a distraction from the deeper work of conscience. As Congress moved on to practical matters, war, finance, alliances, Adams threw himself into the labor of governance with the same unrelenting discipline that had defined his youth. He served on more committees than any other delegate, drafting resolutions, shaping policy, managing correspondence. His energy seemed inexhaustible, though his body often trembled from fatigue. Those who knew him admired his clarity of mind, though few could bear his intensity for long. He demanded of others the same moral rigor he imposed upon himself. "We cannot guarantee success," he told one weary colleague, "but we can deserve it." Outside the hall, Philadelphia was restless. Soldiers marched through the streets, drums echoing against the brick walls. Rumors of defeat, of desertion, of British ships gathering on the coast reached them daily. In the evenings, Adams would walk through the city's narrow lanes, listening to the murmurs of ordinary people, blacksmiths, merchants, widows, whose lives hung upon the decisions made within those rooms. Their faces reminded him that liberty was not an abstraction. It was bread, safety, and the fragile dignity of self-rule. He longed for home, for the simplicity of his farm, for Abigail's clear voice cutting through the fog of politics. Her letters were his compass. She wrote not as a spectator, but as a partner in the struggle, reminding him of the moral foundation beneath the cause. "Remember the ladies," she urged in one famous letter, and though the phrase would echo far beyond its time, Adams answered with a jest that revealed both affection and the blind spots of his age. He could not yet see that the revolution of minds extended beyond men. As months turned to years, the war deepened, and Adams found himself torn between public service and private longing. He missed the laughter of his children, the comfort of familiar soil, yet he knew that his place was among the architects of the new order. In 1777, Congress appointed him to serve abroad, to help secure alliances that might sustain the fragile experiment they had set in motion. The decision filled him with dread. The sea was perilous, disease rampant, and the thought of leaving Abigail for an unknown span of years weighed upon him like an unspoken grief. Still, he accepted. He believed that Providence demands sacrifice of those who claim to serve it. Before his departure, he rode once more through the fields of Braintree. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the apple trees were beginning to bloom. He paused on the hill overlooking his home, its windows glowing softly in the dusk, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the full ache of separation. Then he turned his horse toward Boston, the harbor already bristling with sails. The voyage to Europe was long and brutal. The ship pitched endlessly upon the gray Atlantic, the waves rising like walls around them. Storms tore the rigging, men fell ill, the cold sank deep into their bones. Adams, suffering from seasickness and exhaustion, spent his days reading and writing, forcing order upon the chaos around him. He reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A farmer's son turned philosopher, a lawyer turned revolutionary, now a diplomat bound for a world of kings and courts. In the margins of his journal, he noted the irony that the pursuit of freedom had made him a wanderer. "Liberty," he wrote, "is a jealous mistress." When at last the coast of France appeared through the mist, he felt no triumph, only the solemn recognition of duty renewed. He would soon find himself amid intrigues and rivalries, far from the simplicity of New England virtue. The salons of Europe would test his patience and his faith, for they spoke a language of flattery he could not bear. Yet even before he stepped ashore, Adams knew that the revolution he served was larger than diplomacy, larger even than America. It was the struggle of reason against power, of conscience against convenience. And as the anchor dropped into the cold water, he closed his eyes and listened to the creak of the ropes, the wind in the sails, and the vast, unending silence of the sea. A reminder that every journey of principle begins and ends in solitude. Paris was dazzling and disorienting. a labyrinth of light and indulgence where words like virtue and simplicity sounded provincial. The streets glittered with carriages and perfume, the salons overflowed with laughter and rhetoric, and everywhere, John Adams felt the invisible chill of exclusion. He had crossed an ocean not for pleasure, but for purpose, to secure aid to explain the infant republic's cause to the oldest courts of Europe. But the French world into which he stepped was ruled by appearance, wit, and calculated charm. It was a theater, and Adams was an actor who refused to play his part. Benjamin Franklin, already in Paris and adored as a living emblem of American genius, moved easily among philosophers, courtiers, and ladies of influence, his eyes twinkling, his compliments effortless. Adams admired Franklin's intellect, but distrusted his diplomacy, finding in his genial manner a softness that seemed perilous in a world built on power. "The French love him," Adams wrote, "because he is easy, because he flatters them. I am neither easy nor flattering, and therefore I am little loved." He was not made for intrigue. His speech was too direct, his conscience too insistent. In the salons where philosophy flirted with fashion, he saw more vanity than virtue. He noted with disgust the aristocratic indifference to hunger, the elegant cruelty of leisure. Yet even in his disdain, he remained fascinated. The Enlightenment had here become a spectacle, a set of ideas draped in silk. The same thinkers who preach liberty over wine and wit seem blind to the bondage outside their doors. Adams recorded his impressions with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. He sensed that beneath the surface gaiety, something darker was forming, a fatigue with illusion that would one day explode. "There is in this nation," he wrote, "a ferment that will not long be contained." His words, written years before the storming of the Bastille, reveal the clarity of a man who could see consequence where others saw fashion. But clarity came at a cost. He was often isolated, misunderstood even by his fellow envoys. Franklin's patience with him grew thin, and the French ministers found him too rigid for negotiation. Adams longed for results, not courtesies. He spoke of credit, loans, treaties, matters of survival, while others spoke of charm and reputation. "Diplomacy," he sighed, "is but the art of delay." Yet his perseverance bore fruit in unexpected places. When he was later sent to the Dutch Republic, his unrelenting persistence, so ill-suited to Paris, became his greatest asset. There, among a people who prized commerce, sobriety, and independence, Adams found a kinship of temperament. He arrived in Amsterdam in 1780, a grim and rain-soaked city whose canals mirrored the gray of the northern sky. Europe was weary of war, suspicious of this new republic across the sea, and the Dutch, cautious bankers and traders, were reluctant to lend without assurance. Adams went from one office to another, presenting credentials, writing memoranda, pleading America's case with an almost religious faith and perseverance. For months he was ignored. He fell ill, nearly died of fever, and still he worked. He saw in the Dutch struggle for independence from Spain an echo of America's own. Patience, industry, and perseverance, he told himself, will prevail where genius and eloquence fail. When at last the loan was granted and the Netherlands recognized the United States as a sovereign nation, Adams wrote to Abigail that, "This event is equal to a declaration of independence in Europe." His triumph, however, was quiet and uncelebrated. While Franklin basked in Parisian acclaim, Adams labored in obscurity. Yet he did not envy his colleagues' popularity. He distrusted the seduction of fame as much as he despised hypocrisy. To him, the true measure of service was not applause, but endurance. In long letters to Abigail, he poured out both his frustration and his faith. Her words in return sustained him. They were reminders of home, of the moral clarity that the old world seemed to lack. "I never received a letter from you," he told her, without tears. Their correspondence was a lifeline across an ocean of distance, one mind answering another in the same language of duty and affection. When peace finally came, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Adams found himself once more in the company of Franklin and John Jay, negotiating the terms that would end the war. The British, weary and wary, treated them with a mixture of contempt and respect. The talks were slow, burdened with mistrust. Adams, impatient as ever, urged firmness. "We must be independent," he insisted, in fact as well as in name. His role was pivotal yet again, his persistence ensuring that the new nation was recognized not as a colony freed by mercy, but as an equal among powers. When the final parchment was laid before them, bearing the signatures that would seal the peace, Adams felt a strange melancholy. Victory, he realized, was not a moment of glory but of transition. The revolution, he later wrote, was in the minds of the people before the war was commenced. The war itself was only an effect and consequence. In the months that followed, Adams lingered in Europe, serving briefly as minister to Britain. There, in the court of George III, he stood before the same monarch he had defied and spoke the words that symbolized a new chapter in human history. "I think myself more fortunate," he said, "than all my fellow citizens in having the honor to be the first to stand in your Majesty's presence in a diplomatic character." The king, pale and stiff, answered with courtesy. "Sir," he replied, "I wish you, sir, to believe, and that it may be understood in America, that I have done nothing in the late contest but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do by duty." For a brief, flickering moment, two men who had been adversaries of principle met as equals, both weary of the burdens of their roles. Yet even in triumph, Adams remained uneasy. He longed for the simplicity of home, for the rough honesty of New England, for the quiet that Europe's glitter could never provide. The distance between his ideals and the world he navigated seemed greater than ever. In letters, he confided that diplomacy had taught him more about vanity than virtue. "I have seen courts enough," he wrote, "to say that every man here thinks himself of more consequence than his country." To Abigail he admitted that he yearned not for more honors, but for peace of mind. "I will return," he promised, "and spend the remainder of my days in domestic tranquility." When he finally did return in 1788, the voyage home felt like awakening from a long dream. The air of Massachusetts was colder, cleaner, filled with the smell of pine and sea. The republic he had helped to birth was young, fragile, and uncertain, but it was his. The old farmhouse at Braintree waited for him, its walls familiar, its silence merciful. He rode through the village he had left years before and saw faces changed by war, boys grown into men, old friends now gray and stooped. He dismounted before his door, and Abigail came out to meet him, her smile carrying both pride and relief. The fields, the orchards, the rough stone fences, all seemed to whisper the same thing: that duty fulfilled is its own reward, and that even those who labor unseen are written into the quiet heart of history. As he stood once more beneath the wide New England sky, Adams felt both the weight and the release of his long journey. The winds of revolution had carried him across oceans, through courts and chambers, through loneliness and triumph, and now returned him to the soil that had shaped his conscience. The world would call him diplomat, founder, statesman, but within himself he remained what he had always been, a farmer's son from Braintree, stubborn in virtue, restless in thought, faithful to the truth that freedom, once awakened, demands not adoration but endurance. The evening light settled gently over the hills, and the cry of a distant hawk cut through the still air. In that moment, Adams felt what he had pursued all his life: not glory, not ease, but a fleeting sense of peace, born of purpose. Peace in America was uneasy, a delicate truce between ideal and reality. The war was over, the flag flown, the treaties signed, but the work of building a nation had only begun. When John Adams stepped again onto the worn threshold of his home in Braintree, he found comfort in its simplicity. The wooden beams, the scent of hearth smoke, the rustle of trees that had stood through every storm of his absence. Abigail greeted him with the calm pride of one who had long borne solitude with grace. Their children, now older, moved about the house with the polite distance that time creates. The land looked the same, yet everything in it had changed. The colonies were now states, the people no longer subjects but citizens, and the fragile experiment he had helped to conceive was taking its first uncertain breath. For Adams, this new peace did not bring rest. It brought reflection, and with it, responsibility. He had returned to a nation alive with argument. The Articles of Confederation, though hard won, proved weak. Factions formed, debts mounted, and the promise of liberty seemed to tremble beneath the weight of disorder. Farmers in Massachusetts took up arms in protest of taxes and corruption. Shays' rebellion unfolded not against a distant king, but against the very republic for which they had fought. To Adams, this was the proof of his darkest suspicion, that revolution, unchecked by virtue, would devour itself. He wrote with unease that democracy never lasts long. It wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. Yet even in his dismay, he refused despair. The chaos, he believed, was not the death of liberty, but its painful infancy. A republic, like character, required discipline. Freedom without the ballast of morality would drift toward ruin. He began once again to write essays, letters, reflections on government. He sought not fame but clarity, not applause but understanding. His defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America, published in London in 1787, was his attempt to anchor the new nation in reasoned structure. He warned against the allure of pure democracy, arguing that liberty demanded balance between the one, the few, and the many. History, he insisted, was a teacher of repetition. Monarchies corrupt, aristocracies oppress, democracies collapse into anarchy unless each is checked by the others. To modern ears, his caution sounded conservative, but Adams did not seek to restrain freedom. He sought to preserve it from itself. Liberty, he wrote, must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, but it must be tempered with wisdom. While he wrote abroad, a new constitution was being drafted at home, one that would soon reshape the American experiment. His ideas, though not central, lingered in its spirit. The separation of powers, the distrust of unchecked authority, the insistence on law before passion, all bore the imprint of his reasoning. When news reached him that the Constitution had been ratified, Adams felt both relief and foreboding. It was a foundation, yes, but one that would always need repair. No government, he warned, is more perfect than the human heart that made it. In 1789, with George Washington elected as the first president of the United States, Adams was chosen as vice president, a role ill-defined, half ceremonial, half shadow. It was a strange fate for a man of such forceful mind to occupy a position of quiet dignity. Yet he accepted it with the humility of one who understood hierarchy. "My country," he wrote to Abigail, "has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." He presided over the Senate with decorum, enforcing order but seldom speaking, aware that his every word might ripple into controversy. Still, his presence lent gravity to a government learning to stand upright. Adams admired Washington deeply, though their temperaments differed. Where Washington was statuesque and reserved, Adams was compact, restless, his mind ever turning. He respected the general's stoic silence, but chafed at it too. For Adams was a man who believed that virtue required articulation. He wrote long analyses of government, essays on philosophy, letters to Jefferson on the meaning of republicanism. His thoughts, even when unasked, poured forth like a river too strong for its banks. Many found him overbearing, yet few could deny the honesty of his conviction. He could flatter no one, not even when it would have served him. Popularity, he said, like the wind, shifts with every hour. Principle alone stands firm. Abigail, ever his compass, joined him in New York and later in Philadelphia as the capital shifted. Their home became a haven of civility amid political rancor. She observed the new society forming around them, the diplomats, the intrigues, the fine dresses and new manners, and wrote with equal parts amusement and worry. "We are building palaces before we have laid firm foundations," she told him. He agreed. To Adams, the danger of the young republic was not poverty, but pretense, not tyranny from above, but corruption from within. The pomp of politics offended his Puritan sensibilities. He longed for simplicity, for virtue unadorned, yet he knew that nations, like men, often mistake ceremony for strength. As the years passed, the rivalry between Federalists and Republicans grew sharper. Adams, aligned with the Federalists, defended the need for a strong central government, while his old friend Jefferson championed agrarian liberty and individualism. Their friendship cooled beneath the heat of ideology. Adams respected Jefferson's intellect but distrusted his idealism. Jefferson admired Adams' integrity but recoiled from his caution. "He is so honest," Jefferson once said, "that honesty becomes his greatest fault." Their disagreement was not merely political, it was philosophical, a reflection of two visions of human nature. Jefferson believed in man's innate goodness. Adams believed in man's perpetual struggle with himself. The years of Washington's presidency tested them all. Foreign affairs, debt, rebellion, the specter of European wars, all demanded balance. Adams served faithfully, often advising in silence, sometimes with frustration. When Washington announced his decision to retire, the question of succession cast its long shadow. Adams was the natural heir, though not the favored one. His reputation was of virtue rather than charm, of rigor rather than grace. Yet in 1796, after a bitter and divisive election, he was chosen as the second president of the United States. His victory was narrow, his burden immense. On the evening before his inauguration, he walked through the empty streets of Philadelphia, his thoughts heavy. He was not elated, nor vain, nor even content. "No man who ever held the office," he wrote, "of president would congratulate a friend on obtaining it." The candlelight from tavern windows flickered across the cobblestones as he passed, and the cold wind off the Delaware River carried the faint scent of snow. The Republic was young, fragile, and restless. Its future depended on men still learning how to govern themselves. Adams, more than any of them, knew that revolutions did not end with declarations. They began there. As he climbed the steps of the president's house the next morning, he paused for a moment, his hand upon the rail, and looked back at the people gathered below. They cheered, but the sound seemed distant, almost sorrowful, as if carried by time itself. The boy from Braintree, who had once dreamed of reason shaping the world, now faced the reality of power, the test of principle in the crucible of history. The presidency came upon John Adams not as a crown of honor, but as a sentence of solitude. The moment he took the oath, he felt the immense stillness that follows applause, the sudden awareness that leadership is not an ascent, but a confinement. He was a man born to think, not to flatter, to argue, not to charm, and the office he now held demanded both patience and performance. The Republic was still fragile, its people divided, its government uncertain. He inherited not peace, but suspicion, between Federalists and Republicans, between America and the warring powers of Europe, between liberty's promise and the human tendency toward fear. Washington had been the unifying symbol. Adams, by contrast, was the embodiment of the struggle that unity requires. He governed not through charisma, but through conviction. And conviction, as he knew, isolates the soul. The world beyond the Atlantic seethed. France, in the fever of its own revolution, had turned against the very ideals it once claimed to share with America. Monarchs fell, heads rolled, armies spread like wildfire across Europe. Britain watched warily from its island, calculating advantage. Both nations sought to draw the young republic into their orbit, Britain by trade, France by ideology. Adams saw danger in both. He knew that entanglement abroad could destroy the independence so dearly won. Yet neutrality, in practice, was never neutral. French privateers seized American ships, insulted American envoys, mocked the very idea of a fledgling democracy daring to stand alone. The storm culminated in what came to be known as the quasi-war, an undeclared conflict fought upon the sea. The clamor for open war grew louder with each intercepted vessel, each affronted ambassador. His own party, led by Alexander Hamilton, demanded vengeance and militarization. His opponents accused him of tyranny and British sympathies. Adams stood alone between two furies, the lust for glory and the fear of surrender. He chose neither. Against the passions of his time, he sought peace, not out of weakness, but out of duty. "Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war," he said, "but greater is the folly of refusing one when it is necessary." Every night as the Capitol's arguments echoed through the halls, he withdrew to his study, the candlelight trembling against stacks of papers, and asked himself whether reason could still govern a republic born in revolution. He corresponded with Abigail daily, her letters arriving like breaths of sanity through the political storm. "My country is in its infancy," he wrote to her, "and I am in mine in learning how to govern it." She urged him to trust his conscience over clamor, to remember that popularity is the shadow of virtue, not its measure. It was she who reminded him that peace is often the most courageous policy in a world drunk on victory. When, in 1800, he sent envoys once more to negotiate with France, he did so against the counsel of his own cabinet and the ridicule of his peers. The mission succeeded, the tension eased, and war was averted. Adams saved his country from destruction, and for that he was condemned by those who mistook prudence for weakness. The cost of integrity was isolation. The cabinet he had inherited from Washington was fractured by loyalty to Hamilton, whose ambition knew no limit. Adams, though president, often found himself betrayed by his own ministers, his letters ignored, his orders delayed. He endured it with quiet rage, turning his bitterness inward. "If there is ever to be a contest between intelligence and intrigue," he once sighed, "the latter will win until intelligence learns to stoop." Yet he would not stoop. He dismissed those who defied him, alienating his allies but preserving his self-respect. He governed as he had lived, by principle, even when it cost him everything. Then came the Alien and Sedition Acts, the shadow that would forever stain his presidency. Born of fear, passed in haste, these laws allowed the government to silence dissent and imprison those who spoke against it. Adams did not author them, but he signed them, believing that the nation's survival demanded order over license. In that act, the man who had once defended British soldiers in the name of justice became, in the eyes of many, a hypocrite. Newspapers vilified him, pamphlets mocked him, crowds burned his likeness in effigy. Yet even then, he believed himself right. "A government of laws," he wrote, "is not a government of men." To him, liberty without restraint was anarchy. Freedom required the courage to limit itself. But the nuance was lost amid the shouting. The people he had sought to protect from chaos saw only repression. In his heart, he felt the old Puritan ache, the loneliness of the righteous misunderstood. He read the attacks against him not with anger, but with a kind of sorrowful fascination. The press, unbridled and merciless, painted him as a monarchist, a tyrant, a relic of aristocracy. Jefferson, once his friend, became his rival, orchestrating opposition with subtle brilliance. Their letters ceased. Their philosophies, once intertwined, now stood opposed. Adams sought solace in the few who still believed in the dignity of order. His son, John Quincy, already showing the intellect and rigor of his father, and Abigail, whose faith never wavered. "Remember," she wrote to him, "that great souls are not molded in the ease of favor, but in the fire of adversity." The final years of his presidency were a test of endurance. The capital moved from Philadelphia to the newly built city of Washington, still more a swamp than a seat of government. The president's house, later to be called the White House, was unfinished, cold, and echoing. Adams and Abigail moved in late in 1800, bringing with them a few pieces of furniture, a fire that barely warmed the vast rooms, and a prayer. On his first night there, he wrote a letter to her that has since become a prayer for all who would follow in his steps. "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." But heaven rarely grants such prayers. Before the year's end, the election results arrived. He had lost. The nation had chosen Jefferson. The revolution of ballots had replaced the revolution of arms, and Adams, though wounded, accepted the verdict with the same dignity with which he had fought for independence. He did not wait for the ceremony of transfer. On the cold morning of March 4, 1801, while Washington City still slept beneath its veil of fog, he stepped into a carriage and rode quietly north toward Quincy. The wheels creaked over frozen mud. No crowds gathered. No farewells were spoken. The republic he had nurtured was now in the hands of others, and for the first time in 26 years, John Adams was a private citizen once more. As the carriage rolled through the dawn, he looked back only once. The unfinished dome of the Capitol stood against the pale horizon like a question that history had yet to answer. He had not built perfection, he had built endurance. And in that endurance, he found a strange peace. The work of conscience, he knew, is never completed. It only changes hands. The road home to Quincy was lined with silence, and in that silence, John Adams found the sound of his own humility. The fields of Massachusetts stretched before him, pale under the late winter light. The trees bare, their branches like veins against the gray sky. For the first time in decades, no messenger waited with dispatches, no courier carried his words across oceans, and no council awaited his decision. The weight of office lifted, but so too did the sense of purpose that had long sustained him. The rhythm of his days slowed to the tempo of rural life, the clatter of horses, the creak of a gate, the distant bark of a dog. He returned not as a conqueror nor as a martyr, but as a man who had lived the full measure of principle and its cost. The farm at Peacefield welcomed him as though nothing had changed, yet everything within him had been remade. The soil was stubborn, the air clear, the same neighbors still nodded from their doorsteps, but now he was a relic of a revolution, already fading into legend. Abigail met him at the door, her smile tempered by the lines of age and waiting. In her presence, the storms of public life dissolved into the quiet certainty of affection. She had been his anchor through every storm, his confidant in triumph and despair, and now she was his sanctuary. Their conversations, once filled with politics and principle, softened into reflections on time and endurance. She reminded him that the legacy of a life is not measured in applause but in persistence. "We have done our duty," she said simply, and in her voice was the grace of finality. Yet Adams was not one to rest. Retirement for him was not withdrawal, but contemplation turned to action. He rose early, walked his fields, kept accounts, wrote letters. Letters to Jefferson left unanswered, to friends now gone, to children grown into their own burdens. He studied the newspapers with the same intensity that once guided policy, shaking his head at what he read. "I am no longer of use to my country," he told himself, "but I cannot cease to care for her." Still, he felt the sting of obscurity. Jefferson's presidency glowed with the public's affection. His words turned to melody in the minds of men. Adams, more complex, more austere, lacked such harmony. His defense of law had been mistaken for coldness, his caution for cowardice. The Alien and Sedition Acts clung to his memory like a stain he could not wash away. Yet he harbored no bitterness. "Posterity," he wrote, "may judge me more kindly than my contemporaries." He spent long evenings by the fire, reading Tacitus and Cicero, finding in their reflections on power the comfort of recognition. Empires rose and fell, men adored and condemned their leaders, and history, like the tide, erased its footprints only to draw them anew. In the spring, he took to walking the paths around his home, stopping to watch the apple blossoms open in the orchard. The air was sweet and full of bees. He spoke to the hired hands with the same gravity he once brought to Congress, asking about the soil, the weather, the yield. Work was his therapy, order his refuge. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily labor, thoughts of mortality began to stir. Friends died one by one. Washington, Hamilton, Franklin. Each death was like the closing of a door, leaving Adams alone in the long corridor of memory. "The world I knew," he said, "is vanishing. I remain like an ancient oak after the forest has been cut down." His son, John Quincy Adams, now a rising diplomat, became his pride and preoccupation. In the younger man's calm discipline and moral steadiness, he saw the continuation of his own ideals, purified by restraint. When John Quincy was sent as minister to Russia, the father's letters grew long and full of instruction, at once affectionate and severe. "Duty is the cement of societies," he wrote, "and virtue the soul of nations." He advised him to distrust fame, to fear corruption, to serve not applause but truth. The advice was not only paternal, it was a confession of all that had defined his own restless conscience. Abigail, ever his equal, shared in his reflections but felt the weight of years more tenderly. She still wrote letters filled with wit and moral clarity, but her health began to wane. They sat together in the evenings, the lamplight soft on her face, speaking of the past as though it were a distant country. "We have traveled far, John," she told him once, "and the world we leave is not the one we found." He nodded, too moved to answer. They spoke of their first home, of the Revolution, of the children scattered by duty, and of the slow, unrelenting passage of time. When she died in 1818, after 54 years of marriage, Adams felt the world collapse into quiet. The house seemed larger, the nights longer, the silence unbearable. He walked the halls alone, touching the chair where she once sat, the books she had read, the garden she had tended. "I wish I could lie down beside her and sleep," he wrote, "but I must wait." Yet even in grief, he found discipline. He tended to her memory with the same devotion he had given to his country, orderly, constant, without indulgence. "Grief," he wrote, "is a kind of love that must learn to walk alone." In the solitude that followed, Adams turned once more to thought. His mind, though weary, remained sharp. He read widely from philosophy to natural science, searching for meaning in the patterns of history. The enlightenment that had once inspired him now seemed both triumphant and incomplete. Reason had liberated men from kings, but not from their own passions. "We think ourselves free," he mused, "yet we are slaves to appetite." He came to see liberty not as a gift, but as a burden, a discipline that each generation must learn anew. In his letters, he warned that democracy could decay not through tyranny, but through indifference. Human nature, he wrote, is not to be trusted without restraint. Freedom requires virtue, and virtue is rare. As the seasons passed, his bitterness softened into acceptance. Visitors came to Peacefield, young scholars, politicians, admirers, hoping to glimpse the wisdom of the last living revolutionary. They found an old man still fiery in thought, still unafraid to speak truth. "You are looking at one who has seen the birth of his country," he told them, "and who hopes it may not live to see its death." Yet there was a gentleness now in his defiance, a humility born of long endurance. He spoke of Jefferson without rancor, of posterity without illusion, of history as a mirror in which all men eventually confront themselves. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would rise and look out over the fields, the mist curling over the ground like the breath of time itself. He thought of the path he had walked, from the small classroom at Harvard to the halls of Congress, from the storm-tossed Atlantic to the cold grandeur of the presidency, and he felt no regret. "The end of all government," he once wrote, "is the happiness of society." Whether he had achieved that end, he no longer presumed to know. But he had tried, and in the trying he had kept faith with his own conscience. The years continued to fall away, each softer, quieter than the last. The noise of the world receded. His days were measured now by the sound of a clock ticking in the next room, by the creak of a chair, by the steady rhythm of breath. Yet within him, the same flame that had guided him through revolution still burned. Smaller now, but unwavering. And sometimes, when the wind carried the faint scent of the sea across the fields of Quincy, John Adams would close his eyes and hear again the echo of the voices of his youth, the debates, the oaths, the quills scratching upon parchment, and know that even in the stillness of old age, the revolution had not ended. It had only changed its form, from action to memory, from fire to ember, from nation to soul. There are moments in the dusk of a life when the past ceases to be a sequence of events and becomes a single slow-turning light, each memory circling back upon itself, glowing faintly, yet never going out. In the quiet years that followed Abigail's death, John Adams lived within that light. He was old now, his body frail, but his mind still sharp, restless, unwilling to concede to time what reason had not already surrendered. The house at Peacefield became his world, its walls lined with books, its windows looking out on fields he could no longer walk as he once had. He rose before dawn, read by candlelight, and wrote until his trembling hand grew tired. His letters had become his final form of labor, his way of keeping conversation with an age that no longer asked for his voice. But the old debates of his youth, the meaning of liberty, the frailty of power, the moral architecture of the Republic, never left him. He remained, even in solitude, a man of argument, as though eternity itself required persuasion. The bitterness that had once lingered between him and Thomas Jefferson began, in these twilight years, to soften. The two old patriots, once bound by revolution and divided by politics, found their way back to each other through the written word. Their letters, filled with philosophy, humor, and reminiscence, became the final dialogue of the Enlightenment. Adams wrote with his usual bluntness, Jefferson with his familiar grace, but beneath the style of each there was the same unspoken truth. Both men were weary, both sought reconciliation not merely with one another, but with the history they had made. "You and I ought not to die," Adams wrote, "before we have explained ourselves to each other." And so they did. They wrote of Plato and Bacon, of God and reason, of government and mortality. They disagreed still, but without venom. Their correspondence stretched across years, each letter an echo calling to its reply. Adams often paused over Jefferson's handwriting, its elegant slant across the page, and smiled at the irony that time, which had once separated them, now bound them more closely than ever. "We are two old men," he mused, "who have seen the world turn upside down and survive it." They were no longer rivals but witnesses, two aging minds holding conversation across the distance of memory. Their letters were read aloud to family and friends, cherished as relics of a vanished age. Yet to Adams, they were not monuments, but confessions. Two souls trying to understand how they had become history while still alive. Outside, the nation they had founded grew in complexity and contradiction. The simplicity of their ideals struggled against the weight of ambition, expansion, and commerce. Adams followed these developments with cautious pride. He admired the resilience of the Constitution, but worried that the people mistook freedom for indulgence. "Posterity," he warned, "will never know how much it cost this generation to preserve its freedom. I hope they will make good use of it." He sensed the inevitable distance between the principles of a founding and the realities of governance, yet he refused despair. "There never was a democracy yet," he wrote to Jefferson, "that did not commit suicide." But he added with a flicker of hope, "Ours may be the first that learns moderation." His faith, though tempered by realism, never died. He had grown used to the rhythm of decline, the days spent in quiet study, the nights in contemplation. Visitors came often, drawn by the curiosity of meeting the last living signatory of independence. They found an old man of small stature and bright eyes, whose words came still with force, though softened by age. He would greet them warmly, quote Cicero or Scripture, then send them away with advice that sounded both ancient and immediate. "Be not afraid of virtue, it is the only thing that lasts." To those who asked if he regretted the burdens of politics, he replied simply, "No man who ever served his country honestly can regret the labor." Sometimes, in moments of solitude, he would speak aloud to Abigail, as if she had merely stepped into another room. He told her of their children, of John Quincy's rising career, of the visitors who came and went. He spoke of Jefferson's letters, of the slow unspooling of time. The house, still filled with her presence, seemed to listen. In summer, he sat by the open window, watching the bees among the flowers she had planted, feeling her hand in the order of the garden. Her absence had become a form of companionship, painful but sacred. "I am here still," he would murmur, "but not long." As his body weakened, his spirit seemed to expand. He grew gentler, more forgiving, even toward his own flaws. The vanity that once troubled him now amused him. The pride that once divided him from others, he treated with compassion. "We are all but experiments," he wrote, "in the laboratory of Providence." He read the Bible daily, not with the stern piety of his youth, but with the quiet curiosity of an old philosopher, seeking reconciliation between faith and reason. "God," he told a visitor, "is an equation too vast for human arithmetic." Each evening, as the sun slipped behind the low hills of Quincy, Adams would sit by the fire, his hands folded, his eyes reflecting the fading light. The room filled with the tick of a clock, the whisper of wind against the panes, the faint scent of pine smoke. He would think of the revolution not as a triumph, but as a warning, a reminder that freedom must be tended like a flame, always at risk of extinguishing in neglect or excess. "Liberty," he wrote near the end, "once lost, is lost forever." Yet he believed that every generation might rekindle it if they remembered that virtue, not wealth or glory, was the foundation of republics. In 1825, news arrived that his son, John Quincy Adams, had been elected President of the United States. The old man's eyes filled with tears. The circle of history had closed upon itself. The father who had labored to shape a nation now lived to see his son inherit its stewardship. "He must be greater than I," Adams said softly, "for he was born into what I only dreamed." It was a triumph that felt less like pride than vindication, a sign that the long labor of conscience could endure through lineage, that integrity might be hereditary after all. Winter passed into spring, spring into another summer. Adams slept more now, his thoughts drifting between memory and vision. The faces of his youth appeared to him in dreams. Franklin, Washington, Hancock, Jefferson, all as they had been in the fervor of creation. Sometimes he would wake and speak to them as though they still sat in the chamber at Philadelphia, quills poised, hearts full of conviction. "We did the best we could," he whispered once into the empty room, "and it was not perfect, but it was something good." The morning of July 4th, 1826 arrived hot and heavy with stillness. The air shimmered above the fields, and the house lay quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of curtains stirred by a summer breeze. It was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams lay in his bed, too weak to rise, his breathing shallow, his eyes clouded yet aware. Family gathered at his side, whispering prayers. The old man's lips moved faintly, forming words no one could hear. At last, with a final effort, he murmured, "Thomas Jefferson survives." They were his last words, spoken in the mistaken belief that his friends still lived. But in truth, Jefferson had died only hours earlier at Monticello, as though time itself had conspired to let the two men depart the world together, bound forever by the idea they had dared to declare. The house fell silent. Outside, the sky deepened into gold, and the wind rustled the leaves in the orchard. The sound was like a benediction, like the sigh of history exhaling its gratitude. John Adams, who had believed that conscience must rule over passion, that reason must guide liberty, and that virtue must outlive victory, was gone. The fields of Quincy lay serene, the air still carrying the echo of his last thought, one mind reaching out to another across the divide, as if even in death he could not stop conversing with the living. The news of John Adams's death spread slowly at first, carried along the dusty roads of New England by horseback and rumor, until it reached the cities that had once echoed with his words. Bells tolled in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, their sound mingling with the celebrations of the nation's 50th Independence Day. It was as if the heavens themselves had chosen the symmetry, recalling in a single gesture the beginning and the end of a generation. The people mourned him not with tears alone, but with reflection. They saw in his passing the close of an era when courage was measured in conscience and when government was still a moral experiment. In the churches of Massachusetts, ministers spoke of him not as a hero, but as an example, an imperfect man who had carried principle as both burden and gift. Newspapers that had once mocked him now praised his fortitude, his honesty, his incorruptible devotion to the Republic. Time, which had humbled so many, began its slow work of vindicating John Adams. At Peacefield, the house he had built with Abigail stood silent, its shutters drawn against the summer sun. The rooms that once echoed with argument and laughter now held only the quiet dignity of memory. His books remained where he had left them, his notes neatly stacked, his spectacles resting upon the desk where he had written his last letter. Outside, the orchard bent beneath the weight of ripening fruit. The same bees hummed over the same blossoms that had comforted him in old age. There was no monument yet, no marble to catch the light of dawn, only the house, the fields, and the wind that moved gently through the trees, as if unwilling to disturb his rest. For his family, grief mingled with reverence. John Quincy, now president, bore his father's name with a heavy kind of pride. He wrote that his father's life was a lesson in the labor of liberty, a warning that freedom requires vigilance even in peace. The younger Adams understood the price of conscience better than most. He had seen it lived and paid in his own home. In the years that followed, he often visited the old house, walking its paths in silence, the way his father once had. He found in the stillness a strange continuity, a reminder that the Republic, like the land itself, endured through care, not glory. The public remembered John Adams chiefly for his role in the Revolution, yet those who studied him more deeply found in his private writings the soul of the philosopher behind the statesman. His letters and diaries revealed a man who had lived in conversation with himself, forever questioning the balance between liberty and order, ambition and virtue. In his youth, he had feared pride. In his old age, he had learned humility. He had fought not for power, but for structure, not for passion, but for principle. Human nature, he wrote, is the same in all ages and countries. It is weak and wicked. It must be restrained by law. To some, that view seemed pessimistic, to others, prophetic. For Adams had foreseen that republics, no less than monarchies, could perish when they mistook license for liberty. In the years after his death, the memory of Adams receded into the background of the American pantheon. Washington remained the father, Jefferson the dreamer, Franklin the sage. But Adams, the thinker of contradictions, was more difficult to mythologize. He lacked simplicity. He was too human to be sanctified. Yet his influence lingered in the institutions he helped shape, in the habit of moral self-scrutiny that still murmured beneath the noise of politics. Historians would later call him the conscience of the Revolution, the embodiment of that austere integrity that turns rebellion into law. He had always known that history would misunderstand him. It was a burden he had accepted early, almost with defiance. "My gift," he once said, "is not to charm, but to endure." Endurance. This was his true legacy. While others sought immortality in fame, Adams found it in continuity, in the quiet conviction that ideas, once spoken with honesty, outlive the men who utter them. He believed that the health of a nation depended not upon its heroes, but upon its citizens, their virtue, their education, their sense of duty. The preservation of liberty, he warned, depends upon the intellectual and moral character of the people. They must learn to sacrifice their passions to their reason. It was not an easy doctrine for a young and restless nation to love, but it was one it would one day need. As the 19th century unfolded, the country grew vast and divided, the frontiers pushing westward, the old certainties dissolving in ambition. Yet beneath it all, the foundations that Adams had defended, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the insistence that government must rest upon character, held firm. His fears, too, proved prescient. The rise of factions, the intoxication of democracy, the peril of populism, each generation in its own crisis would rediscover him. His words, written in solitude, became a warning to the future, whispered across centuries. Because power corrupts, society's demands for moral authority and character increase as the importance of the position increases. Visitors to Quincy in later decades spoke of the serenity that lingered around Peacefield, as though the air itself carried the residue of reflection. Children played where soldiers once marched, and the hills that had watched over a revolution now watched over a republic learning to govern its own contradictions. In the churchyard nearby, beneath a simple stone, John and Abigail lay side by side, the Puritan and the philosopher, the conscience and the heart. Their epitaph was modest, their resting place unadorned, but those who stood there felt the gravity of a life lived in the service of something larger than ambition. And so the memory of John Adams faded not into obscurity, but into permanence, the kind of permanence that does not demand attention, but endures like the rhythm of the sea or the turning of the earth. His was the life of a man who believed that freedom, to survive, must be earned again each day. He had spoken often of posterity, of those who would inherit the Republic's promise, and though he did not know their names, he trusted that some would remember. "The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people," he wrote, "a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations." It was that revolution of thought, the inward awakening, that he had spent his life defending. Now, 2 centuries later, his words still echo, faint yet clear, like the tolling of a distant bell. They remind us that liberty is not born in battlefields, but in conscience. That truth, once chosen, must be chosen again. That the worth of a nation is measured not in its wealth or power, but in the integrity of its reasoning. John Adams did not seek immortality, and that is why he achieved it. He stands still among us, not in marble or myth, but in the stubborn endurance of a principle, that freedom without virtue is nothing more than permission, and virtue without freedom is merely obedience. The fields of Quincy still sleep beneath the same sky that once stretched above his youth. The wind moves through the apple trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and memory. And somewhere in that quiet, between the rustle of leaves and the long sigh of the horizon, one can almost hear his voice again, not lecturing, not boasting, but reflecting, as he always did, on the delicate and eternal balance between conscience and power, reason and desire, the individual and the world. The revolution, he would remind us, was never merely an event. It was and will always be a condition of the human spirit. History has a way of reducing great men to a few polished words, of sanding down their doubts and temper until they shine cleanly for the classroom wall. Yet John Adams, when remembered honestly, resists that simplification. He was never the figure of marble that later generations wished to carve. He was of flesh and thought and restlessness. The portrait that endures is of a mind in perpetual argument with itself, a man too intelligent to be content, too moral to be still. Even after his death, those who studied him could not easily place him among the saints of the Revolution. He was neither visionary like Jefferson nor heroic like Washington. His genius was of a quieter kind, the genius of endurance, of seeing both sides of virtue and still choosing it. And in this complexity lay his true worth, for he represented not perfection, but the long labor of conscience that underlies the American experiment itself. To understand Adams is to understand the unease of liberty, the recognition that freedom is not the natural state of man, but a discipline requiring constant effort. He had seen what unbridled passion could do: the mob in Boston, the fever of France, the divisions within the young republic. He understood, more deeply than most, that democracy was not a guarantee of justice, but merely the opportunity for it. His writings pulse with this awareness, his words sometimes weary, sometimes hopeful, always questioning. "I must study politics and war," he once wrote, "that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." It was both prophecy and prayer. He imagined a future where his descendants might escape the burden of politics and live in the refinement of peace, though he knew the cycle of human folly too well to fully believe it. Yet he hoped, and that hope, wrestled from realism, not illusion, was perhaps his most enduring act of faith. His later reputation would rise and fall with the tides of public sentiment. In the early 19th century, he was often forgotten, overshadowed by the elegance of Jefferson's words and the mythic dignity of Washington's silence. But with time, historians and citizens alike began to sense that Adams had been the truer mirror of the Republic's conscience. The flaws that had once made him inconvenient, his stubbornness, his temper, his refusal to flatter, came to seem like virtues in an age hungrier for authenticity than charm. He had stood for principle when it was costly, for peace when it was unpopular, and for honesty when it was unfashionable. These were not qualities that win the hearts of crowds, but they are the qualities that preserve nations when crowds forget what they are cheering for. There is something profoundly American in the tragedy of Adams's obscurity. He built structures that others inhabited, argued truths that others adorned, fought for a reasoned republic while others romanticized its birth. Yet perhaps he preferred it so. He once wrote that vanity was the most dangerous passion of all, and that history, in seeking to crown men, often distorts the truth of their labor. "I wish not to be loved," he confessed to a friend, "but to be just." His notion of immortality was not the fame of monuments, but the survival of ideas. If the nation endured, that would be enough. And indeed, when later generations rediscovered him, when his letters were published and his words given voice again, they found not a relic, but a living teacher. His reflections on government, on human nature, on the tension between freedom and responsibility, felt not distant but immediate. It was as though his voice had been waiting in the silence, knowing that sooner or later the Republic would need his caution once more. Visitors to his old home in Quincy have often spoken of the strange intimacy that seems to linger there. The rooms are small, the furniture plain, the shelves heavy with books whose spines are worn by use. It is not the house of a grand statesman, but of a working mind. One can almost hear the creak of the chair where he once sat, writing into the night, the scratch of the quill, the murmur of thought half-spoken. In the garden, the apple trees still bloom in spring, their branches heavy, their fragrance soft. It is easy to imagine him walking there at dusk, his hands clasped behind his back, his thoughts circling as the wind moves through the leaves. The simplicity of that place captures the essence of the man far better than any monument could. A life rooted in reason, disciplined by labor, softened by love. Even in his most private reflections, Adams wrestled with the meaning of faith. Raised in the strict Calvinism of New England, he spent his life negotiating the space between religion and reason. He believed in providence, yet doubted theology. He revered Scripture, yet distrusted its interpreters. To him, morality was the truest expression of divinity, the evidence of God in the conduct of men. To be good, he wrote, and to do good is all we have to do. He saw no contradiction between faith and philosophy. He saw in both the same demand for self-examination. That balance, too, became a legacy. In an age increasingly torn between zeal and skepticism, Adams's quiet reconciliation stands as a reminder that truth need not be absolute to be sacred. As the 19th century advanced and the Republic stretched westward, Adams' descendants continued to bear the mark of his temperament. John Quincy carried his father's discipline into diplomacy and the presidency. Charles Francis Adams, his grandson, would later defend the Union in its darkest hour. The family's long chain of service became an inheritance not of privilege, but of obligation, a living testament to the old patriarch's creed that virtue must be transmitted like a torch, not a title. And yet, beyond blood and lineage, his influence seeped more subtly into the American mind. Every time the nation debated law over impulse, conscience over popularity, duty over convenience, his ghost stood quietly in the background, nodding in stern approval. For Adams, history itself was a conversation across generations, a moral dialogue between the living and the dead. He had lived his part of that dialogue with all the earnest imperfection of a man who knows that truth is never fully possessed, only pursued. His words, preserved through time, are less a declaration than a question. What does it mean to be free, and what are we willing to sacrifice to remain so? His life never offered a simple answer, but rather a map of the struggle itself, a pattern of effort, error, humility, and resolve. And perhaps that is why he remains so human to us now, because he did not represent the finished virtue of a founding myth, but the ongoing work of an unfinished nation. In the soft distance of time, his voice fades but does not disappear. It lingers, carried on the quiet winds that move through the hills of Massachusetts, in the turning pages of his letters, in the measured cadence of his prose. It reminds us that the republic he helped to build is not a monument, but a conversation, one that must be renewed by each generation with the same mixture of fear and faith that defined his own. And if, in the stillness of an evening, one listens closely enough, one might still hear the faint rhythm of his pen, the murmur of his reasoning, the prayer that was hidden beneath every argument, that this fragile experiment of liberty might learn to outlast its passions, and that reason, however weary, might continue to guide the heart. Time, which erases so much, seems to have grown gentler with John Adams. As the years passed and the republic he helped to shape survived its tempests, the harsh judgments once leveled against him began to dissolve into understanding. Historians, seeking to trace the anatomy of the American conscience, found themselves returning to Adams's letters and essays, to his self-doubts and his faith in principle. They discovered in him not merely a political figure, but a moral philosopher, one who had grappled all his life with the contradictions that still define freedom. His writings became less a record of events than a meditation on the condition of being human in a world of power and imperfection. In an age increasingly seduced by the myth of effortless greatness, Adams's struggles, his loneliness, his stubbornness, his unrelenting pursuit of virtue, began to feel familiar again, even necessary. He seemed to belong not only to the 18th century, but to every century in which conscience must choose between truth and convenience. The renewal of his reputation did not come suddenly. It began quietly in the study of scholars, in the rediscovery of his correspondence with Abigail and Jefferson, in the recognition that his life was not a straight path of triumph, but a spiral of learning and humility. Those letters revealed a voice intimate and intelligent, capable of irony, yet never of cynicism. They showed a marriage that was a partnership of minds, rare even in their own enlightened time. The world began to see that Adams's greatness was not in his victories, but in his perseverance. The constancy with which he labored to understand right conduct amid confusion. The image of him as a cold, humorless moralist faded. Instead, readers found warmth in his candor, dignity in his doubt, and a deep, humane intelligence in his relentless honesty. The complexity of his thought also began to influence how later Americans viewed their own institutions. In an age of expansion and self-confidence, Adams's cautionary wisdom rang like an echo from the founding generation, reminding the nation that liberty is not a birthright guaranteed by paper, but a practice sustained by character. His insistence on the rule of law, his distrust of unchecked power, whether of a monarch or a mob, seemed newly relevant as the young country confronted its own capacity for excess. The Republic's triumphs, he would have said, demanded as much vigilance as its perils. Public virtue cannot exist without private, he had written, and public liberty cannot exist without virtue. The simplicity of that principle, so often overlooked in the noise of ambition, gave his voice a prophetic clarity long after his death. Adams's philosophy, grounded in the discipline of moral realism, offered a counterpoint to the romantic optimism that had colored much of the early republic. Where Jefferson envisioned progress as the natural course of man, Adams saw it as an achievement wrestled from our lesser impulses. He did not distrust democracy out of arrogance, but because he understood its fragility. He believed that the same passions that inspire men to freedom can, if untended, drive them toward tyranny. This tension between hope and restraint, faith and reason, remains the beating heart of his legacy. It is why his words still breathe when others have faded. Because we are ambitious, he warned, we must be humble. Because we are free, we must be disciplined. These are not the proclamations of an age, but the lessons of experience distilled into wisdom. In the later 19th century, when America began to transform from a republic into an empire of commerce and industry, Adams's warnings were read again with new urgency. His correspondence, newly published, offered not nostalgia, but guidance. He had anticipated that power, once achieved, would test the moral foundations of freedom more severely than its pursuit ever had. "It is not the cry of independence that preserves liberty," he wrote, "but the constant, quiet practice of it." In those words, many found a mirror held up to their own restless time, a reminder that progress without virtue is merely motion without direction. Peacefield itself, the old home at Quincy, became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors wandered its narrow corridors, reading the inscriptions on his books, gazing at the chair by the window where he had read and written until the end. The simplicity of the place spoke more eloquently than any monument. It was a house of order and reason, a domestic republic ruled by discipline and affection. The orchards still bloomed, the fields still bore fruit, as if the land itself had absorbed his belief that labor and morality are one. Those who came expecting grandeur found instead humility, and in that humility, a kind of grace. By the turn of the 20th century, Adams's name had re-entered the public imagination as a symbol of integrity, a standard by which to measure the nation's own soul. Statesmen quoted him, historians praised him, and ordinary citizens found in his life the comfort of knowing that imperfection could coexist with greatness. His struggles made him approachable. His endurance made him noble. In his combination of intellect and decency, America recognized something of its better self. The Republic, now grown beyond his imagining, continued to stumble through the same dilemmas that had haunted him: the balance between freedom and order, between ambition and restraint. Each time the country faced those questions anew, his voice returned, reminding it that every generation must begin again the labor of virtue. What remains most moving about Adams is not his success, but his humility before the vastness of history. He knew that the ideals for which he had lived were beyond any single life to complete. The work of liberty, he believed, is endless, a task inherited, not accomplished. His faith was never blind. It was an act of will, a discipline of mind and heart against despair. "I must not despair," he once wrote during the darkest days of revolution, "because I have seen too much reason for hope." It is that sentence, perhaps more than any other, that captures him. A man who looked upon the failures of mankind and still chose belief over bitterness. In the long rhythm of history, the lives of founders often become myth, their flaws erased, their humanity polished away. But Adams's humanity is what keeps him alive. His words, so personal and precise, still touch something intimate in the reader. They remind us that the pursuit of virtue is not the province of saints, but of ordinary people who refuse to abandon reason, even when it costs them comfort. He believed, to his last breath, that integrity was the highest form of courage. And though his name may not be spoken with the easy reverence given to others, his example endures in the quieter ways that matter more, in the patient acts of fairness, in the courage to disagree honorably, in the uncelebrated moments when conscience triumphs over convenience. When we look back on him now, across the centuries, what we see is not the cold figure of a founder, but the warm outline of a man who lived by the light of his own understanding and never let it dim. The revolution that had defined his youth had passed into history, but the revolution of conscience he carried within him remains unfinished. It is the inheritance he left to all who would think before they act, and act because they must. And so, even now, the fields of Quincy hold something of his presence. A whisper in the wind, a faint murmur of thought carried through the rustling leaves. It is the sound of a mind still at work, asking the same question it asked in life. What is the duty of a free man in a world forever tempted by ease? The answer, as always, lies not in what he believed, but in how steadfastly he refused to stop believing. The centuries that followed did not erase John Adams's presence so much as diffuse it, like the slow dissolving of light through morning mist. His image, less grand than Washington's and less poetic than Jefferson's, began to feel quietly human, perhaps even prophetic. In the sweep of American history, he became the necessary balance, the counterweight to passion, the conscience standing behind the rhetoric of freedom. And yet, beyond his politics, what endures most is the shape of his interior life. A restless intellect bound to moral restraint, a man who wrestled with thought as if it were both his cross and his salvation. His words, scattered through thousands of pages, reveal a lifelong dialogue between faith and reason, hope and doubt, ambition and humility. Each sentence seems to arise not from certainty, but from the labor of arriving at it. There is in him a sense of moral movement, of thought as an act of courage. Perhaps this is why he continues to speak to every age that comes after. The mind of a man who, though born in the 18th century, was already arguing with the future. Adams never mistook ideas for idols. He believed that the human mind was capable of virtue, but only through discipline, through the daily work of choosing right over easy. His reflections on government were inseparable from his reflections on the soul. He saw the Republic not as a machine, but as an organism whose health depended on the moral fitness of its citizens. Our Constitution, he wrote, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. To modern ears, this can sound austere, even paternal. Yet beneath the sternness lies a deep tenderness for humanity, the recognition that freedom without moral purpose would leave men wandering among appetites like travelers without a compass. For Adams, law was not an instrument of power, but a form of love, a structure that gave meaning to liberty, the way bones give shape to flesh. He had always distrusted perfection. He believed that the notion of an ideal state, untroubled by conflict or compromise, was a mirage that led to tyranny. The world, he wrote, is governed by passions, by the necessity of circumstances, by habits, and not by reason alone. That admission did not make him cynical, it made him patient. He understood that progress comes not from purity, but from persistence, that the true strength of a republic lies not in its triumphs, but in its capacity to correct itself. His life, full of argument and reconciliation, became the very pattern of that belief. He fought with friends, lost elections, endured ridicule, and still returned again and again to the work of reason. If Washington embodied the dignity of restraint, Adams embodied the endurance of self-scrutiny, the quiet, exhausting effort to align belief with behavior. In later generations, as America moved from its agrarian infancy to the roaring machinery of modernity, Adams's skepticism of unchecked ambition grew newly relevant. He had warned that the pursuit of wealth and comfort, if left without conscience, would corrode the very spirit that made the Republic possible. "Public virtue cannot survive private vice," he wrote, and though his language was of another time, the truth within it was timeless. He foresaw a day when power would shift from governments to markets, when persuasion would become performance, when the idea of service would struggle against the lure of self-interest. And yet, he refused despair. His faith was never in institutions alone, but in the capacity of the human heart to learn through failure. He saw moral education, not dogma, but understanding, as the only antidote to corruption. To govern well, a people must first govern themselves. That was the foundation upon which he believed the American experiment must continually rebuild itself. Even now, when one reads his words, they do not feel like relics, but like a mirror, reflecting both the clarity and the fatigue of conscience in every age. He does not flatter the reader with easy faith. He asks questions that still unsettle. Can a society built on liberty remain virtuous without the fear of consequence? Can equality survive ambition? Can a republic of self-interest sustain justice? These are not the questions of a statesman secure in power, but of a man who knows how frail civilization is, how easily it can be undone by indifference or excess. Adams's gift was to translate philosophy into the rhythm of daily life, to remind us that democracy, for all its grandeur, begins in the choices made in silence, in the invisible governance of the self. The memory of Adams has become, in a sense, the nation's conscience, quiet, often overlooked, yet always returning in times of confusion. His name appears when history bends toward corruption and must be recalled to principle, when the noise of politics overwhelms reason, and someone must remind us that truth does not shout. He stands not as a symbol of perfection, but as a witness to the effort of it. His life demonstrates that failure, when met with integrity, is not defeat, but education. I have come to the conclusion, he wrote late in life, that human virtue is not to be relied upon without eternal vigilance. The sentence reads less as cynicism than as prayer, a humble acknowledgement that goodness, like freedom, is never secure. In the modern age, when the founders have become myth and history itself has turned into spectacle, Adams's realism feels like an anchor. He reminds us that ideals are only as durable as the people who believe in them, that freedom requires not only passion but patience. He belongs not to the past but to every moment when a nation must pause to remember what it was made for. He believed that the work of preserving liberty would never end, and that this endlessness was not tragedy but grace, the constant opportunity for mankind to renew itself. Standing before his grave in Quincy, one can feel that continuity. The stone is plain, the inscription modest, the air heavy with the scent of grass and salt from the nearby bay. Yet beneath that simplicity lies a life that once shaped the fate of continents. The same wind that moved through his apple trees still moves there now, stirring the leaves, whispering the old questions he never stopped asking. What is justice? What is duty? How shall we live together and remain free? They are not answered in the stillness, but the asking of them is answer enough. In that quiet persistence, John Adams lives on, not as a monument, but as a voice within the conscience of a people still learning, still arguing, still hopeful that the balance he sought between reason and passion might yet be found. There is something in the endurance of John Adams that speaks to the quieter, more difficult side of greatness. He did not embody the mythic simplicity that history prefers. He was full of contradiction, but within those contradictions lived the truth of a mind unwilling to rest on certainty. The nation he helped imagine had outgrown its infancy, had fought its own second revolution in civil war, and had grown into a power far beyond anything he could have conceived. Yet his words, his reflections, his doubts continued to move beneath the surface of American thought like a current beneath calm water. His legacy did not roar, it murmured. It was there in every statesman who spoke of duty before ambition, in every citizen who distrusted the easy rhetoric of power. Adams's America was not the land of triumph, but the land of conscience, a republic of imperfect people striving toward virtue, aware always that virtue was not a gift, but a discipline. He would have recognized, even from his place in eternity, the cycles of enthusiasm and decay that followed. He had seen them in miniature in his own age and knew they would repeat: passion-kindling revolution, complacency dimming it, corruption creeping in through the cracks of abundance. Power must never be trusted without a check, he had written, and that warning outlived him, reappearing like a moral refrain in the times when the Republic seemed most confident. He had no illusions about permanence. Nations like men could only remain free if they remembered their fragility. In that humility lay his vision of greatness. He believed that the worth of a people was not measured by their victories, but by their capacity to confront their own flaws and amend them without surrendering to despair. That conviction, that honesty about imperfection, is the truest form of strength, was his lasting gift. Adams's writings, read now, possess the tone of a man speaking both to his age and beyond it. His language is deliberate, almost mathematical in its order, yet behind its formality there is an undercurrent of emotion, a sense of longing for a harmony he rarely found in life. He sought in the law and in reason the structure that the world denied him. Virtue, he wrote, is not always rewarded, but it is always right. That was the principle that had cost him friends, elections, and ease, yet it was also the foundation upon which he built his faith. He lived as if the human soul, however clouded by passion, was still capable of clarity. This belief, at once austere and generous, made him the moral philosopher of the Revolution, the one who understood that the birth of freedom would mean little unless it also gave birth to conscience. Over time, his words became a kind of map for those who came after him. Leaders read his letters not for comfort but for correction. His insistence that government must be guided by character rather than charisma found new life in eras of disillusionment. To some, he seemed old-fashioned. To others, he seemed prophetic. The age of empires, the Industrial Revolution, the long wars of the 20th century, all would confirm what Adams had always known, that civilization survives not through progress alone, but through the moral stamina of its citizens. He foresaw that knowledge, untempered by wisdom, could destroy as easily as it could liberate. There never was, he warned, a democracy yet that did not waste itself by excess. He had not meant this as condemnation, but as counsel, to remind his descendants that liberty must live not in the noise of its declaration, but in the quiet restraint of its practice. His letters to Jefferson, preserved like sacred dialogues, stand now as the closing movement of an unfinished symphony. Their exchanges, stretching from politics to philosophy, from God to mortality, form one of the most intimate records of friendship in human history. They spoke of youth and memory, of lost ideals, of the distance between reason and belief. Reading them today, one can feel the slow reconciliation not only of two men, but of two ways of thinking, the romantic and the realist, the visionary and the skeptic. Through those letters, Adams and Jefferson continued their lifelong debate, but it was now softened by affection, by the awareness that both had been instruments of the same vast design. In their correspondence, the nation's founding ideals became human again, stripped of ceremony, illuminated by vulnerability. It was as if, in their final years, they were writing not to each other, but to the future, confessing that freedom is beautiful because it is unfinished. In the modern world, where noise has replaced thought and conviction is often mistaken for anger, Adams's voice sounds almost alien in its patience. He did not argue for agreement, but for understanding. He believed that the mind's highest act was not victory, but comprehension, the ability to hold opposing truths in tension without surrendering to either. That balance, that discipline of thought, was what he called reason's morality. It demanded humility, and humility is perhaps the rarest virtue in a nation that prizes certainty. Yet he knew it was the only virtue that could preserve democracy. The liberty of man, he once said, depends not upon his power but upon his wisdom. Perhaps that is why his spirit still hovers over the Republic like a stern but patient teacher. His lessons are not loud. They live in the conscience rather than the crowd. He reminds us that freedom is not self-sustaining. It is a fragile creation, born of self-knowledge and guarded by law. He would look upon the world of today, vast and connected, full of invention and appetite, and see not triumph, but test. He would ask whether the republic he helped to build still remembers the discipline that made it possible. And perhaps in our better moments, when noise recedes and reflection takes its place, we can still hear his answer moving through the air, that the survival of liberty depends not upon those who shout for it, but upon those who quietly live by it. On certain evenings, when the sky over Quincy turns the color of faded parchment and the wind moves gently through the orchard, one can almost imagine him there again, a small, determined figure walking slowly along the worn path, hands clasped behind his back, lips moving as if reciting one last argument to himself. In the distance, the faint toll of a church bell mingles with the sound of leaves. The light fades, and the world softens into stillness. If one listens closely enough, one might hear his final thought carried in the air, as constant as breath. That truth, though fragile, endures. That principle, though costly, redeems. And that the conscience of a single life, however human, can still shape the destiny of a nation. The memory of John Adams drifts now like an undercurrent through the centuries, less visible than the monuments and myths that dominate the surface of history, yet deeper, steadier, and somehow nearer to the human heart. In him, the idea of the Republic still breathes, not as a relic of parchment and ceremony, but as a living argument, forever incomplete. The man who once paced through candle-lit rooms, torn between caution and conviction, would perhaps recognize in our age the same uneasy rhythm of hope and fear that marked his own. He understood better than most that the work of freedom does not end with its declaration. It begins with the endless labor of understanding what it truly means. His voice, though softened by time, remains that of a patient witness, reminding us that liberty is not the absence of restraint, but the mastery of it. Not a privilege to be possessed, but a responsibility to be renewed. There was in Adams a kind of moral stubbornness that the modern world, in its hunger for compromise and speed, often forgets how to value. He believed that truth must be defended even when it is inconvenient, even when it isolates, even when it costs more than silence can repay. He carried that principle not as a weapon, but as a burden, a conviction that weighed upon him because he knew how fallible he was, how easily righteousness can curdle into pride. This humility beneath conviction is what made him singular among the founders. He never confused moral clarity with moral superiority. To be good, he had written long before his presidency, is to be forever vigilant against oneself. Those words have the quiet gravity of self-knowledge. He had lived long enough to see virtue misused and idealism twisted, but he never let disillusion harden into cynicism. His hope, though scarred, was honest, and his integrity endured precisely because it was tested. In his writings, there is always the sense of a man arguing with himself, each page a dialogue between what is and what should be. He had no patience for the romantic notion of human perfectibility. He believed instead in the endless work of moral maintenance, in the necessity of thought to temper desire. Human passions, he wrote, are like the elements. They may be useful servants, but are dangerous masters. That metaphor, simple yet profound, still captures the tension at the heart of all politics, the need to balance fire with reason, power with restraint. Adams did not trust enthusiasm, but he never dismissed it either. He knew that passion ignites progress, just as discipline preserves it. The art of statesmanship, to him, was not to suppress human emotion, but to guide it toward justice. It was the same art by which he governed his own restless heart. His domestic life, which so many later found remarkable, was itself a study in that same balance. The letters between John and Abigail form a dialogue that transcends the private sphere. They are both love story and moral education, a record of two minds reasoning their way through duty and desire, distance and devotion. She was his equal, sometimes his critic, always his mirror. Her words tempered his excesses, grounded his intellect in tenderness. Together, they built not merely a home, but a kind of living philosophy. That virtue must begin in the household, that the habits of fairness and restraint cultivated between two people are the same that sustain a nation. When he wrote, "You are my dearest friend," it was not sentimentality, but reverence, the acknowledgement that his moral strength was, in part, borrowed from her steadfastness. Even in the years after her death, her presence seemed to remain beside him, a conscience within his conscience. It is easy to forget that Adams's mind, so concerned with law and principle, was also deeply attuned to nature. In his old age, he found in the turning of the seasons a rhythm that mirrored his own philosophy. The orchard in Quincy, with its patient cycles of growth and decay, became a living metaphor for the republic he had helped to found. Every spring, he would watch the buds appear, fragile yet full of promise, and see in them the same peril and beauty that he saw in liberty itself. Freedom, like fruit, could not be forced into ripeness. It demanded care, patience, pruning. He often said that the farmer and the statesman labored in the same spirit, both working with forces beyond their control, both sustained by faith that their efforts would bear fruit long after they were gone. That faith, humble and enduring, was the quiet theology of his later life. In the great arc of history, Adams represents a type of courage that has become rare, the courage not of the battlefield, but of reflection. His battles were fought in words and in silence, in the refusal to bend when bending would have been easier. He reminds us that strength is not always loud, that dignity often resides in persistence rather than victory. He was, as Jefferson once said, as honest as an angel and as wary as a serpent. That wariness, that unromantic awareness of human frailty, is perhaps his truest legacy. For even now, when the Republic trembles under the same forces of division and desire that haunted its birth, Adams stands in memory as the patron saint of reasoned resistance, the one who believed that principle, if lived quietly enough, could still outlast noise. The historian who studies him must eventually confront not only his writings, but his silences, the pauses between his words, the moments of self-doubt that reveal the cost of conviction. In his diary, he once confessed that he had been carried away by zeal and ambition, and that the desire to do good had often led me astray. Such lines are rare in the records of the powerful. They remind us that Adams's greatness was not in his certainty, but in his willingness to admit error. He believed that repentance was not weakness, but wisdom, the mind correcting itself as the body heals from a wound. That capacity for self-revision, for moral recalibration, is what makes his life not only admirable, but instructive. And so, as the centuries stretch onward, Adams remains a voice both distant and familiar, a moral pulse that steadies in the background of the nation's story. When we read him now, it is not merely as a founder, but as a companion in our own uncertainty, a reminder that doubt, honestly held, is itself a form of faith. His words return like the slow tolling of a bell, patient, unwavering, solemn. They ask of us what he asked of himself, that we act not for glory, but for the quiet satisfaction of having done what is right, even when no one applauds. In this, his revolution never ended. It simply turned inward, becoming the daily revolution of conscience that each generation must continue. In the final silence of his life, Adams seemed to have understood that immortality was not in fame or even remembrance, but in example. "To believe all men honest is folly," he wrote once, "but to believe none is something worse." Between those two extremes he lived and died, a realist without bitterness, a dreamer without illusion. And if the Republic endures still, it is in part because he taught it how to think, and through thought, how to endure. The light fades, but not completely. It settles into the landscape like evening itself, gentle, enduring, and impossibly human. History, in its vast indifference, often forgets those who love their country through reason rather than through fire. It remembers the generals, the orators, the visionaries who spoke in thunder, but not always the steady laborers of thought who built the moral architecture beneath the noise. John Adams belonged to that second, quieter lineage of greatness, the kind that does not glitter, but endures. He was, and remains, the embodiment of that rare conviction that virtue and intellect, not charisma, are the foundations of freedom. His life reminds us that the Republic, like the human soul, depends less on passion than on the integrity that outlasts it. In Adams, the modern world finds not a monument of marble, but a mirror, one that reflects the eternal tension between the individual and the ideal, between conscience and ambition, between the private life of the mind and the public burden of duty. To read his words now is to be drawn into that tension, to feel how deeply he wrestled with the contradictions that still define us. He loved liberty, but feared license. He cherished democracy, but distrusted the crowd. He was both revolutionary and conservative, both dreamer and disciplinarian. In his complexity lies a kind of modernity, an understanding that progress is neither inevitable nor pure, that the pursuit of justice must be guided by structure as much as sentiment. His realism, which his contemporaries mistook for coldness, has aged into clarity. "The happiness of society," he wrote, "is the end of government." It is a sentence that seems simple until one realizes the depth of its challenge, that government exists not for power, not for grandeur, but for the moral well-being of its people. Adams's definition of happiness was not pleasure, but virtue in practice, the quiet dignity of a citizen who governs himself so that he might be fit to help govern others. He saw the Republic as a great moral experiment, fragile in its novelty and dangerous in its potential. "Remember," he warned, "that democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." But he did not mean this as a curse. He meant it as a call to vigilance, to self-knowledge, to the endless maintenance that freedom demands. His realism was not despair, but discipline. It was the understanding that liberty, like any living thing, survives only through care. He was too honest to promise the permanence of ideals, but he believed deeply in their worth. That belief, lived daily in work and reflection, became his quiet defiance against both cynicism and idolatry. He lived for no mythology. He lived for truth, knowing how much it costs. In his old age, he had written that, "Posterity will never know how much it cost this generation to preserve your freedom." He was right. And perhaps he knew that he spoke not only of the revolution, but of the eternal cost of conscience itself. His life was the measure of that price. Every friendship tested, every principle defended, every defeat endured. These were the currency with which he purchased a small piece of moral order for the generations to come. Even his failures had the texture of integrity. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which nearly destroyed his reputation, stand as a testament to the dangers of fear and to the courage of reflection that later made him admit that even right motives can lead to wrong ends. His willingness to learn from error, to see himself within the same flawed humanity he tried to govern, makes him not lesser but greater. He did not pursue perfection, because he knew perfection was not the province of men. He pursued honesty, and that pursuit alone gave his life its enduring power. There is something profoundly moving in the way Adams aged into humility. The man who had once argued with the world ended by conversing with it gently, as if he had come to understand that the truth, though absolute in principle, must always be spoken with tenderness. The sharpness of his youth softened into contemplation. His letters to Jefferson, those luminous exchanges between two minds reconciled by time, show the beauty of reconciliation that arises not from agreement, but from forgiveness. In those letters, written in the fading light of their years, one feels not nostalgia but understanding. The two men who had once been rivals became mirrors of each other. Adams, the realist, softened by memory; Jefferson, the idealist, humbled by experience. Together, they gave America something more enduring than any policy, the example of friendship restored by reason. To imagine Adams now, centuries later, is to imagine a presence rather than a person. His words hover in the air like the steady ticking of a clock, a reminder that time moves, that virtue requires rhythm, not haste. He still speaks through the laws that protect liberty, through the quiet dignity of reasoned debate, through the persistence of those who choose integrity over applause. His spirit endures in every act of conscience that defies fashion, in every citizen who insists that thought must precede action. The republic he helped to shape is still an unfinished work, and perhaps it always will be. Adams would have wanted it so. He understood that permanence is not the goal of freedom. Renewal is. At Peacefield, the seasons continue their patient cycles. The trees that once shaded his walks still flower and fall. The air still carries the scent of salt and earth. Inside, the desk where he wrote remains by the window, facing the same horizon he used to contemplate. The simplicity of that room, its worn chair, its shelves of books, its absence of grandeur, tells us more about his character than any monument could. He sought not immortality, but understanding. He would have smiled, perhaps, to know that in time, history returned his reputation, not by mythologizing him, but by recognizing his humanity. It is tempting, when speaking of the founders, to turn them into symbols, to lift them out of the realm of error and doubt. But Adams resists such elevation. He remains, as he always was, defiantly human, a man who believed that truth must coexist with imperfection. His life is a reminder that greatness does not require brilliance untainted by flaw, but courage, unbroken by failure. He taught, by example, that integrity is not a posture, but a practice, that wisdom is not the absence of error, but the presence of reflection. And perhaps that is why, in the long silence after the revolution's noise, it is his voice that still feels closest, not because it shouts, but because it endures in thought, steady and alive, reminding us that reason, though fragile, is the truest measure of freedom. There are times when history itself seems to grow weary of its heroes, when it turns its gaze away from glory and looks instead toward endurance, toward those whose lives illuminate not the triumph of power, but the persistence of principle. John Adams belongs to that rare company. He did not conquer. He argued. He did not charm. He persuaded through the stubborn gravity of his mind. The arc of his life was not one of conquest, but of continual reckoning with his country, with his conscience, with the elusive balance between intellect and faith. In him we find the pattern of the republic he helped to found, principled, fallible, self-correcting, always struggling toward its own ideal. His story is not a monument, but a mirror, reflecting what remains most demanding about freedom, the obligation to think and to do so honestly. Even now, when the name of Adams is spoken, it evokes a certain austerity. He was never the man of easy gestures or romantic phrases. His greatness was measured not in sentiment, but in clarity. In an age intoxicated by revolution, he remained sober enough to understand that liberty, if untempered, can consume itself. He saw that the same passions that inspire independence can also corrupt it. That vision, at once unsettling and prophetic, became the moral compass of his life. It made him cautious where others were bold, thoughtful where others were loud. Yet it also condemned him to a kind of solitude, for the world seldom loves those who remind it of its limitations. Adams bore that solitude with dignity. He knew that to serve truth was often to walk alone, and he walked that path without bitterness. There was a moral plainness to his temperament, an absence of artifice that both elevated and isolated him. While Jefferson soared in the lyricism of his ideals, Adams remained grounded in the logic of his convictions. He believed that ideas must live not in eloquence, but in action. His vision of government, though less poetic, was more enduring because it rested upon character rather than charisma. Public virtue, he wrote, cannot exist without private. In those few words lies the entire philosophy of his statesmanship, the conviction that the fate of nations is inseparable from the moral discipline of individuals. He warned that a society enthralled by wealth or vanity would lose its sense of justice long before it lost its laws. To govern others, one must first govern oneself. That ideal, so simple yet so demanding, remains the silent heartbeat of the Republic. Adams understood that institutions cannot preserve liberty if the people within them are careless of truth. The Constitution, he knew, was only parchment unless animated by conscience. He had seen the dangers of both monarchy and mob rule, and so he dedicated his life to the delicate art of balance, the architecture of restraint that turns chaos into order without extinguishing freedom. To him, the revolution was not an event, but a temperament, the constant effort to reconcile energy with ethics, power with principle. It was this understanding, more than any policy or presidency, that made his legacy essential. He did not merely help to build a nation, he helped to define the inner discipline that would sustain it. In his later years, when the noise of public life had faded and he lived surrounded by the soft hum of the fields, Adams seemed to become what he had always aspired to be, a philosopher of democracy, a citizen of the long view. Visitors who came to Peacefield found him vigorous in mind, unpretentious in manner, as likely to speak of the latest scientific discovery as of politics. He saw knowledge as a form of piety, curiosity as a moral act. "Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write," he had once declared, and he never ceased to live by that creed. The Republic, he believed, would perish not from tyranny, but from ignorance. Education was not luxury, but survival, for only an informed people could resist the seductions of demagogues. He distrusted the unthinking crowd not because he despised the people, but because he revered their potential. He wanted them not merely to be free, but to be wise enough to remain so. The correspondence between Adams and Jefferson, which had begun in the ashes of rivalry and matured into one of history's most profound conversations, captures this vision of wisdom born from contradiction. In those letters, the two men wrestled gently with the same questions that had haunted them since youth. What is the destiny of mankind? Can virtue survive power? Does progress lead to enlightenment or merely to new forms of decay? Their exchanges were not arguments but meditations, filled with humor, resignation, and wonder. They wrote as men who had seen too much to believe in perfection, yet not enough to stop believing in possibility. "You and I ought not to die," Adams wrote, "before we have explained ourselves to each other." And so, they explained, until explanation became communion. Theirs was not just the reconciliation of two friends, but of two visions of America, the pragmatic and the poetic joined at last by the humility of age. As Adams approached his final years, the sharpness that had defined his youth softened into something like serenity. He no longer sought to persuade the world, he sought to understand it. The same intellect that had once bristled at opposition now rested in contemplation. He had outlived the fever of politics and arrived at a kind of moral equilibrium. He spoke less of nations and more of humanity, less of freedom as victory and more of it as stewardship. The republic he had helped to found was now in the hands of his son, and though he watched its growing pains with the worry of a father, he also felt a deep, quiet pride. The experiment continued, and that was enough. "Posterity," he had written, "will judge us kindly, for we mean to do well." That belief, half prayer and half defiance, remained his last and most unshakable faith. In the long dusk of his life, when the light fell through the orchard and the shadows of the apple trees lengthened across the grass, Adams would sometimes sit by the window and watch the day fade. The air would cool, the crickets begin their soft hymn, and he would think, perhaps, of all that had passed, the debates, the voyages, the quarrels, the dreams, and see in them not glory but pattern. He had lived long enough to understand that meaning is seldom immediate, that the truth of a life lies not in its victories, but in its endurance. And so he endured, quietly, steadily, as the Republic itself endured. In that endurance was his final act of faith, that reason, though fragile, can survive passion, that conscience, though fallible, can still guide the human heart, and that a single life lived in fidelity to principle can outlast the ages. The wind moves still through the trees at Peacefield, carrying the scent of salt from the harbor, the hum of bees in the summer air. The house remains, modest and ordered, its rooms full of books, its silence full of thought. Visitors walk through its halls and feel something they cannot name, a kind of gravity, the residue of a life lived with intention. Perhaps they sense what Adams himself believed, that freedom is not an inheritance, but an agreement renewed every day between memory and will. His voice lingers in that place, low and steady, as if still reminding the living that revolutions are not ended by declarations, that liberty must be tended like a flame, and that the measure of a republic lies not in its wealth or its armies, but in the honesty of its reasoning. The legacy of John Adams does not stand in marble or echo in anthem. It breathes in quieter ways, in the habits of thought that govern a people long after their founders have turned to dust. It exists in the balance between power and principle, in the uneasy marriage between ambition and restraint, in the belief that the measure of a nation is found not in its triumphs, but in its capacity for self-correction. Adams's life was the embodiment of that belief. He did not seek immortality in stone or rhetoric, but in the moral architecture he helped to raise, a republic built not on reverence, but on reason. His ideas, once dismissed as cautious or severe, have aged into clarity. In an age that prizes speed over substance and spectacle over sincerity, his example stands like an old clock, its steady rhythm undisturbed by the noise around it. He reminds us that the durability of freedom lies in discipline, and that the work of conscience is never finished. To understand Adams is to understand the slow labor of democracy itself. He knew that liberty, once proclaimed, must be cultivated generation after generation through education, civility, and the vigilant restraint of power. He feared that the real enemy of freedom would not come from without but from within, from complacency, from corruption, from the easy seduction of comfort mistaken for peace. He wrote that every republic carries the seeds of its own destruction, and that its preservation depends upon the character of its citizens. For him, politics was not an art of manipulation, but of moral geometry, the drawing of lines that keep the passions of men from devouring their better nature. He trusted law more than impulse, yet he never ceased to believe in the capacity of ordinary minds to learn and grow. The revolution, he said, had been in the minds and hearts of the people long before it reached the battlefield, and he knew that this revolution of understanding must never cease. There was, in his vision of the future, both hope and warning. He foresaw a nation of vast energy, driven by invention and appetite, capable of greatness and ruin alike. He believed that the promise of America would not be tested in its infancy, but in its maturity, when abundance would tempt it to forget restraint, when power would challenge its virtue, when freedom would demand the discipline it once inspired. Because power corrupts, he wrote, society's demands for moral authority and character increase as the importance of the position increases. Those words, once meant for presidents, now seem to speak to citizens themselves. Adams's faith was not in leaders, but in the people's ability to govern their own desires through reason. He did not romanticize the human spirit. He respected its frailty too much for that. Yet his realism was a form of reverence. He believed that the human capacity for improvement, however slow, was the truest evidence of divine design. The modern age, for all its technology and progress, has not outgrown the questions that haunted him. How shall a free people remain virtuous in a world that rewards indulgence? How shall truth endure when noise multiplies faster than thought? How shall conscience prevail in a marketplace of vanity? These were not problems of his century alone. They are the inheritance of everyone that follows. Adams's voice, steady and unadorned, reaches across the distance of time not to lecture, but to remind that the foundation of freedom lies not in laws or armies, but in the quiet, daily exercise of judgment. The Republic, like the soul, survives only by self-scrutiny. In the evening of his life, Adams seemed to find in nature the peace that politics could not offer. He had long since learned that the world's order, though imperfect, carried its own wisdom. The rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the patient return of spring, all these confirmed his belief that endurance is itself a form of grace. He saw in the orchard's renewal each year an image of the Republic's own cycles, its stumbles, its recoveries, its promise of regeneration. Posterity, he once wrote, will never know how much it cost to preserve your freedom. The line was both lament and benediction. He knew that the labor of liberty is invisible when it succeeds, that its victories are measured not in celebration, but in the absence of decay. The best proof of a republic's strength, he would say, is not the noise of its glory, but the quiet of its justice. Perhaps that is why Adams still feels so near to us, why his presence lingers even when his name is seldom invoked. He represents the conscience of democracy, the voice that asks again and again whether we deserve the freedom we claim to cherish. His life was not a romance but a discipline. His faith was not blind, but chosen, daily in the face of disappointment. He lived long enough to see the world change beyond recognition, yet he never surrendered his conviction that truth, however fragile, endures. It is a conviction that still whispers beneath the noise of our own century, where freedom is too often mistaken for indulgence and reason for delay. Adams's legacy reminds us that the real courage of democracy lies not in rebellion, but in reflection, not in the assertion of will, but in the acceptance of responsibility. The story of John Adams, when told in full, is not merely the biography of a man, but the moral autobiography of a nation. His life traced the arc from revolution to governance, from zeal to wisdom, from the noise of birth to the quiet labor of endurance. He understood that independence was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of it, that the price of liberty would be vigilance unending. His was not a tragic story, but a human one, marked by failure and redemption, by pride and repentance, by the long reconciliation of faith and reason. In that humanity lies his lasting gift. For the republic he helped to create is not sustained by heroes, but by citizens willing to think, to doubt, and to act with conscience. And as long as there are such citizens, somewhere within the turning of their thoughts, the voice of John Adams continues, patient and firm, calling them back to the work of virtue. When the evening deepens over Quincy and the air thickens with the scent of salt and harvest, the house at Peacefield seems to breathe with that quiet continuity. The orchard rustles, the sky darkens, and the first stars appear. Each one a point of light against the dark, as constant as the conscience of a man who refused to abandon reason. Somewhere in that stillness, it is possible to imagine him walking once more beneath the trees, his hand grazing the rough bark, his eyes lifted toward the fading horizon. He would say nothing. He would simply stand, listening to the wind, knowing that the republic he helped to shape would live on not through memory alone, but through the unending effort of minds still awake, still questioning, still faithful to the restless truth that freedom requires thought. There is, in the long silence that follows a life like John Adams's, a kind of resonance that deepens rather than fades. His voice does not echo loudly across the centuries. It hums softly beneath them, steady as the pulse of the conscience he served. His story ends not in grandeur, but in equilibrium, in the image of a man who gave himself entirely to the difficult art of thinking clearly in an age intoxicated by passion. He stands now at the edge of history's great procession, not as a conqueror or a saint, but as something rarer, a mind that sought not dominion, but understanding. It is that pursuit, unceasing, honest, often lonely, that grants his life its quiet permanence. For Adams's greatness was never in what he conquered, but in what he resisted, the temptation to surrender principle to popularity, truth to comfort, or reason to noise. If the republic can still trace its moral spine through the fractures of its own ambition, it is in part because of him. He gave it the architecture of conscience, the insistence that no government can outlive the virtue of its people. That idea, radical in its simplicity, remains the core of the American experiment. It demands not faith in perfection, but faith in effort, in the perpetual discipline of self-examination. Adams understood that democracy would be an unfinished creation, as fragile as thought itself, forever depending on those who could think beyond themselves. He was not seduced by the illusion of inevitable progress. He knew that every advance of liberty carried its own shadow, that human nature would forever oscillate between reason and appetite. To govern well, he said, is to navigate that tension without despair, to hold fast to law not because men are angels, but because they are not. In this way, Adams remains the most paradoxically modern of the founders. His belief that truth is both moral and procedural, that justice is not revealed but constructed through the honest friction of minds, anticipates the very essence of deliberative democracy. He distrusted all systems that promise certainty, preferring the unending argument of free people reasoning together. Facts are stubborn things, he once declared in a Boston courtroom, and in that simple phrase lies his entire philosophy. That truth may be contested, but not erased, that it must be defended by reason, not rage. He carried that conviction like a lantern through every dark corridor of his public life, from the courtroom to the Continental Congress, from the loneliness of diplomatic exile to the cold dignity of the presidency. And even in failure, the light never wavered. To live as Adams did, to think, to argue, to endure, was to accept the loneliness of clarity. His devotion to principle often made him seem severe, yet beneath that severity lay tenderness, particularly in the realm of affection. His love for Abigail, recorded in their letters, reveals a man more human than history often admits, a husband who depended on the intelligence and steadiness of his wife as much as on his own reason. Their partnership, spanning continents and crises, was an education in balance, thought tempered by feeling, conviction softened by love. In her, he found not only comfort but counsel. She reminded him that reason divorced from compassion becomes tyranny of another kind. Together, they embodied what he believed a republic required: mutual respect, constant dialogue, moral restraint. That intimacy, sustained through the upheavals of revolution and distance, became the emotional grammar of his political philosophy. The recognition that freedom must be relational, rooted not in isolation, but in shared responsibility. It is easy now, looking backward, to see Adams as an abstraction, a figure in a history book, a name beneath a date. But to stand in the dim light of his study at Peacefield, to see the uneven grain of the desk where he wrote, is to sense something living. The desk bears the wear of thought, the soft indentation of elbows pressed during nights of reflection. His pen, worn thin at the grip, rests as though he might return at any moment to complete another argument. The window above the desk opens onto the orchard, where the trees bend under the slow weight of fruit, their branches trembling in the wind. There is no sound but the rhythm of the leaves, the small, perpetual conversation between nature and time. It is a fitting silence, the silence of a man who spoke enough, who questioned enough, and who left the answers to those who would come after him. For that is perhaps the deepest meaning of Adams's life, that the pursuit of reason is never finished. Every generation inherits his question, how to live freely and justly in a world forever tempted by excess, and must answer it anew. His wisdom was not in providing solutions, but in modeling the humility of inquiry. He showed that freedom is not sustained by certainty, but by the courage to keep asking. The revolution he helped ignite was never meant to end in peace, but to continue in thought. And so, his spirit survives wherever reason resists dogma, wherever honesty prevails over expedience, wherever the mind refuses to sleep. When we look back on Adams now, we see not only the history of a man, but the endurance of a principle, that the moral worth of a nation depends upon the integrity of its thinking. His was a life that made intellect itself an act of devotion, that turned philosophy into public service and reflection into courage. He did not seek to be admired, he sought to be understood, and in understanding, to make his country wiser than he was. That is perhaps the most generous legacy of all. As the night settles over the old house in Quincy and the wind quiets, there remains a faint sense of presence, as though thought itself lingers where it has once been deeply lived. The orchard stands still, the horizon blurs into darkness, and the stars emerge, silent and impartial. Somewhere among them, beyond measure or monument, one imagines the spirit of John Adams still at work, not presiding, not preaching, but reasoning, endlessly reasoning, as though eternity were itself another long conversation. The revolution continues there, quiet and infinite, carried forward not by armies or banners, but by the restless light of the human mind, seeking, always, to know what is right and to live by it.